Before we start, one quick thing. Everything on this channel is read by me, a real person. Name's Robert, by the way. No AI voice, no synthetic narration. If you are tired of being read to by a machine, the best thing you can do is drop a like, leave a comment, and hit subscribe. It is a small thing, and it is what keeps human narration alive on this platform. I read every comment that comes in, and here is something to leave in that comment while the fire is still lit. What is the most cut off, middle of nowhere? I have no damn business being here, you have been. Somewhere the nearest other person was miles or kilometers for you non-American viewers. Away and not coming? I often use response to questions like these in some capacity in my future stories. Now, get comfortable, turn the lights down low, and let the horror begin. There was blood on the snow, and George was kneeling in it, and he was happy. He had a buck down in the laurel above Coldwater, a good one, 8 points, and he had opened it from the brisket to the pelvis the way his father taught him, and steam was coming up off the gut pile into the cold, and George Halbrook was as close to peace as his kind ever gets. He hummed while he worked. He wiped the blade on his pant leg, and he hummed, and I stood 11 yards back of him in the hemlock where the shadow was already thick at 4 in the afternoon, and I watched him be happy, and I thought, the time has come for you now, George. All those years you called yourself the hunter of this country. All those mornings you drove up the grade before light with the rifle across the seat and told your wife you would be home when you were home. You were never the hunter here. You only never met the thing that was. I had been reading him for a long time by then. People do not know that about me. The ones who have made up their little stories about what I am, the ones who leave meat on a stone at the head of a hollow and think they have paid me. I do not come out of the dark all at once. I come slow. I get to know a man first. I learn his truck and his boot print and the way he stands at the edge of a field reading the wind, and I learn the other things too, the things he does behind the last door in his own house with the porch light off. That is the meat I have a taste for, not the lost, not the unlucky, not the boy who takes a wrong turn off Forest Road 250 and freezes in a creek bottom crying for his mother. That boy is nothing to me. He is clean, and clean does not fill me. I have eaten 100 winters of the clean and gone back into the ground still empty, because there is nothing in them that is already mine. George was already mine. He had been mine for years and did not know it. I carried that down the mountain behind him that afternoon, closer than his own shadow, patient as the cold. The country matters, and the country is half of what I am, so the country comes first. North of the town of Mennig, in the middle part of this state, there is a state forest they call Coldwater, 200,000 acres of it, ridge and hollow, oak and hemlock, and the black tangle of the laurel where a grown man cannot walk upright. There are logging grades in there, gone back to moss, and coal patches where the company towns died 100 years ago, and creeks the color of tea. And at the heart of it, where the town of Mennig used to stand before the ground turned against it, the earth is on fire. It has been on fire underneath since before George was born. A coal seam caught down in the old mine works, and it never went out, and it never will, and it burns down there in the dark, eating its way along the veins of the mountain a few feet a year. The ground above it is bald. The snow will not lie on it. Steam comes up out of the cracks in January, and the bare dirt is warm to the hand, and the smell is sulfur and cooked stone. And the people who are left in Mennig call that ground the cinders, and they do not go there, and they teach their children not to go there, and the children mostly listen. I keep to the cinders. It is the one warm place in a cold country, and I am cold all the way through, colder than the snow, colder than the creek under its ice, and the warm ground is the nearest thing to comfort a thing like me is allowed. I take them there when I am done reading them. What the fire takes is never found. There is no bottom to it. There are men down in the warm dark under Mennig that this county mourned for a week and then rounded down out of its own memory, and I put every one of them there, and every one of them had earned the trip. How does a thing choose? I will set it down plain, because George deserved the plain telling more than most, and because I have never once lied to the ones I take, not in all the years. Lying is a human thing. It is one of the things that makes a man taste the way George tasted. I do not choose the way a man would want me to. I am not justice. Set the pretty idea aside right now, the one where the monster comes for the wicked and the good sleep safe. I am not that. I am hunger, and I am only hunger, and I have been hunger since a starving man in a starving winter. 1,000 years gone did the thing that cannot be taken back and became the first of what I am. There is nothing left in me but the wanting. I want the way fire wants, and I learned over more winters than this forest has rings that most people cannot feed me. The clean ones go through me like water. I take them, and I am hungry again before the snow has closed over the place they stood. But the cruel ones, the ones who have already been feeding on somebody, the man who comes home and makes the whole house go quiet when his boots hit the porch, the one who runs a company town into the ground and sells the water rights and drives out past the shut mine in a new truck, the one who smiles in the daylight and is a different animal after dark. Those ones are already half of what I am. They have already started the long hollowing out. They have a taste to them, a taste of the thing I became, and when I take one of those I am filled. Not for long. Nothing fills me for long. But for a while, in the warm dark under the cinders, I am something close to at rest, and that is the only rest there is for me, and I have learned to hunt for it the way a man learns to hunt for anything he needs and can only rarely get. So no, I am not the county's dark angel. I do not save the beaten wife by taking the man who beats her. The saving is a thing that happens next to me, off to the side, the way a field mouse gets away while the hawk is busy with the rabbit. I do not do it for her. I have never once done anything for anyone. I take the man because the man is the only thing in this whole clean country that I can stand to eat, and if his taking means a light stays off in a bedroom in Mennig and 3 people under that roof learn what a full night of sleep feels like, that has nothing to do with me. That is just what is left when the cruel are gone. I do not get to want it. I only get to want the meat. George Halbrook was the best meat this forest had grown in 40 years. I had known his family longer than George had. I took his grandfather in the winter of 1951 off the ice of the reservoir where the man had gone to drown a litter of pups his own dog had thrown. And I remember the grandfather tasted the way George would come to taste. That same taste. Because it runs in some blood the way a bad hip runs in some blood, passed down, waiting. I let George's father alone. The father was weak, but he was not cruel. Only a drunk, only sad. And sad is clean, and I have no use for the sad. I saw George come up under that sad, drunk father, and I marked the taste come into him early, by the time he was a boy of 10 or 11, and I knew then that I would have him one day, the way a man knows a green apple will be worth eating if he can only wait. I waited 39 years. I watched him become the man the town of Mennig admired. He was loved, and that was what made him worth the wait. He guided out of a little outfitter's shop on the Coldwater Road, took men up into my country after bear and buck and turkey, and they trusted him with their lives up there, and he never lost one. Not a single client in 22 years. And they came down off the mountain telling everyone that George Halbrook was the finest woodsman in the state. He sat on the volunteer fire board. He bought the Christmas tree for the square out of his own pocket the year the borough could not. He had a wide, easy laugh and a hand that swallowed yours when he shook it, and every soul in that town would have sworn George was one of the good ones. And I knew what was behind the last door in his house. I had kept the tree line behind that house on 100 winter nights, and I had heard it, the wife who flinched when the truck came up the drive. The boy who had learned to be quiet the way a rabbit learns to be quiet, which is a thing no boy should have to learn. The other things. I am not going to lay the other things out here. Some of what George did in that house does not need saying, and I will not say it, because saying it would be the closest I ever came to feeding on the ones he hurt, and even I have a line. though it does not seem a thing though I would not have thought it myself before I had watched that house for as many years as I did. I will only say that the wide, easy laugh in the daylight and the thing in the dark house were the same man, and that the second one was the true one, and that the true one had a taste I had been hungry for since he was a boy. I knew George better than anyone alive knew him. That knowing is what made the waiting bearable, if bearable is a word for what I do. A wife knows the man across the table. The men at the outfitter's shop knew the man who sold them tags and told them where the bear were feeding. The burro knew the man who bought the Christmas tree. I knew all of those men, the whole set of them George kept and wore in the daylight, and I knew the one underneath, and I had seen the daylight ones get built up over him one at a time, across 40 years, the way a man builds a blind, stick by stick, until the thing inside cannot be seen from any road. I watched him at the shop in the good years. He was easy there, easy the way a man is easy when he has an audience and a mirror in every face. He would lean on the counter with a mug of coffee going cold in his hand and tell a client the story of the big bear he took off the Cinders Road in some October back before the seam fire had eaten so far. And the client would lean in, and George would time the laugh, and the man could tell a story. He could make you love him in under a minute. That was the terrible gift of him. He never once used it to make a man feel small in front of others. He saved that for the house. He saved all of it for the house. I stood at the tree line behind that house through more winters than the boy was alive, and I learned to read a lit window the way George read a wintering yard. I learned the good nights, when the truck came up the drive and nothing happened, when the daylight George stayed on past the porch and the house stayed a house. And I learned the other nights by the way the lights moved, by which lights went out and which stayed burning, by a shape crossing a curtain too fast, by the long stretches after when no light moved at all and the house sat there in the cold, holding its breath the way the woods hold their breath. When I am in them, I never went closer than the tree line. There was a line I would not cross, and I have wondered since why a thing with no mercy in it kept to that line, and the nearest I can come is that going closer would have been feeding on the ones inside, on the wife and the boy, on the clean, and the clean turned to ash in me, and some old instinct kept me back at the trees the way it keeps a man from putting his hand in a fire he knows will not warm him. The boy is the part I will not lay out. I said I would not, and I will not. There was a winter, the boy maybe 9, when the lights in the house did a thing I had not seen them do before, and I stood at the tree line that night, and the wanting in me turned into something I do not have a name for, and it was almost for one moment not hunger, and I nearly crossed the line I had held so long. I did not cross it. I held to the trees, and I think now that this was the night the taste in George went from a thing I would take someday to a thing I had decided to take the night the someday got a date on it, even if the date was still years off, even if I would make myself wait until the boy was grown and gone and safe before I let the country close around his father. A thing like me does not decide much. It wants and it takes. But I decided about George that night in the trees behind the house, the boy 9 years old and the lights doing what they did, and once I have decided I am the most patient thing in this world, and the most certain. So when I stood 11 yards back of him in the hemlock that first afternoon, as he hummed over the gut pile of his 8-point buck, as close to peace as his kind ever gets, I was not a thing that had wandered up out of the ground and found a man to eat. I was the end of a road 40 years long. I had seen him become the finest woodsman in the state, and I had marked the true George grow underneath the daylight one like rot growing under bark, and I had waited through the boy's whole childhood, through the leaving, until the house was down to the two of them and the taste in George had cured all the way through. The mighty hunter, they called him in Mennig. He hunted my country for 50 years, and never once knew it was mine, never once knew that the thing he should have been hunting had been 11 yards behind him the whole time, learning him, keeping the date. The winter I finally came for him was the winter he turned 50. His boy was gone off to the service by then, out from under the roof, safe, and I was glad of it in the cold sideways way I am ever glad of anything, because It meant the boy would not be in the house when the town started asking where George had gone. His wife was alone with him now. It had gotten worse since the boy left, the way it does. The cruelty needing somewhere to go, and only the one place left to put it. I could have taken him any of 1,000 nights. I did not. I had waited 39 years, and I wanted the taking to be worth the wait. I wanted the mighty hunter to know, before the end, exactly what he was, and exactly what had been hunting him all along. The whole time he thought the country belonged to him. So, I did not come to him in the house. I came to him in the woods, on his own ground, where he was proudest, and I took my time and I let him feel it start. It started the first afternoon I let him see the game was gone. A man like George reads the woods the way you read the faces of the people you live with. He does not think about it. He walks into a stand of oak in the gray before light, and some old part of him, under the thinking part, counts the country and tells him whether it is right, and if it is right he settles in and hunts. And if it is wrong he feels a low itch he cannot name, and he blames it on the wind or on his coffee, and he hunts anyway. George had 30 years of that undercounting in him. It was the truest thing about him, truer than the laugh, maybe the only clean thing he had left. And it was the door I came in through, because when I want a man to feel me before he sees me, I take the country apart around him a piece at a time, quiet, so that the under part of him is screaming, while the thinking part still has no words. I started with the deer. There is a bench of oak flat above the Coldwater Road that George had hunted every season of his life. His father had hunted it. It held deer the way a good field holds deer. Always had a wintering yard where they came down out of the high laurel to the acorns, and George could sit that bench on the worst slow morning of the season and know that sooner or later a deer would move. The morning after I took the 8-point buck off him, he went back up to that bench in the dark and he sat it until noon, and nothing came. That happens. A slow day is a slow day, and a woodsman knows it and does not fret. He came back the next morning. Nothing. The morning after that he found the yard, the packed trails and the beds and the droppings where 40 deer had been living all December, and it was empty, all of it, the beds gone cold, the trails filling with new snow, not one animal in a piece of country that should have held a herd. And George stood in the middle of that empty yard with his rifle hanging in his hand, and he felt the first cold finger of it go up his back. The under part of him counting the country and coming up with a number that was wrong. He told himself pressure. He told himself the other camps must have pushed them, or the coyotes had moved through heavy, or the acorn crop had failed higher up and drawn them off. And every one of those was a thing that could happen, and not one of them was true. And the under part of George knew it was not true, even while the thinking part lined the excuses up. Like a man stacking wood against a storm, he will not admit he sees coming. I had moved the deer. That is all. I do not have to touch a deer to move it. I only have to be in the country, be what I am, let the animals feel the old wrong thing walking their ground, and they go. They pour out of a hollow ahead of me, the way water pours out of a tipped bucket. They know what I am, even when the men do not, and they do not stay to find out if this is the winter I have come for them. They simply leave, all of them. And the country I am hunting in goes empty, and stays empty, and grows quiet. And the quiet is the first thing a man like George is built to notice. Then I took the birds. It does not seem a thing a man would notice. The chickadees. They are the smallest thing in the winter woods, and they are always there, always, working the hemlock in their little bands, cheerful in a country that has no other cheer in January. A man sits a stand for 6 hours, and the chickadees come and work the branch over his head and land on his rifle barrel, and he barely sees them. They are so much a part of the woods that they have gone invisible, the way a man's own heartbeat is invisible. But take them away. Let a man sit 6 hours in a hemlock stand and hear nothing, no small busy voices, no wing beat, no rustle, only his own blood in his ears and the tick of the cold in the wood. He will notice that. Not with the thinking part, with the under part, the old animal part, the part that is known since before there were men that a woods gone silent is a woods with a killer in it. George sat his stand on the 4th morning, and the woods around him held its breath, and by 10 o'clock he was turning in his seat every few minutes to look behind him, and he did not know why, and he could not stop. That was the morning he first felt watched. Men always get this part wrong when they tell it. They make it a shudder, a chill, a knowing. It is not like that. Being watched by me is not a feeling that comes down over a man like weather. It comes up out of him, from the bottom, from the animal, and it feels like memory. It feels like something he already knew and had forgotten. George sat that silent stand and turned to look behind him for the 10th time, and there was nothing there. Only the gray hemlock and the snow. And he turned back, and the feeling did not go. The feeling got worse, and under it, way down, some part of George that was 10 years old again was saying a thing to him, without words, was saying, "You know this. You have always known this, was up here. You knew it the way you knew about the last door in your own house. You just never let yourself turn all the way around and look." He climbed down out of the stand at noon, and he walked the long way back to the truck, and he did not take the shortcut through the laurel that he had taken 10,000 times, and had anyone asked him why, he would have said the snow was too deep in the laurel, and that would have been a lie, and the under part of him would have known it was a lie. I let him get almost to the truck before I let him see me the first time. Not see me the way the stories go. I do not walk out into a field in the daylight and let a man get a good long look. That is not how it is done. What George saw at the edge of the clearing where he had left the truck, 40 yards off, in the black wall of the hemlock, was a piece of the shadow that was too tall and too thin and too still, a vertical dark that had a wrongness to its proportions. The way a word spelled almost right is wrong, and it was there for the length of one breath, and it did not move, and it was gone. He did not even startle. A shape that jumps out startles a man, and the startle is almost a relief, because a startle has an end to it. The heart pounds, and then it slows, and the man laughs at himself. This was not that. This was a thing that was there and then was not, with no motion between, no branch stirred, no snow knocked loose, and it left George standing at the tailgate of his own truck with his hand on the cold metal, not breathing, while the thinking part of him worked hard and fast to build him a shadow, a trick of the light, a snag he had seen 1,000 times and never noticed, and while the under part of him stood dead still inside him and said, "Quiet, that was the thing. That was the thing you have always known was up here. It let you see it. It wanted you to." George got in the truck and he drove down the Coldwater grade too fast, and at the bottom where the road came out by the shut mine and the bald warm ground of the cinders, he had to slow for the bad frost heaves, and he looked out across the cinders as he passed the way everybody looks, the way you cannot help looking at a thing you are afraid of, and the steam was coming up out of the cracks in the bare ground into the cold blue evening, and for just a moment, standing out on that bald warm dirt where the snow will not lie, a long way off, small with the distance, there was the vertical dark again, watching the road, watching him. Then the road bent, and the hemlock came between, and it was gone, and George drove home to the house where the porch light was off, and his wife heard the truck come up the drive, and the whole house went quiet the way it always went quiet, and George sat a long time in the cab before he went in, looking at nothing, and the cruelty in him, the taste I had waited 39 years for, was, for the first time in his whole life, laced through with something else. It was laced through with fear, and the meat of men has a truth in it that I learned over more winters than a man could count. Fear does not spoil it. Fear cures it. Fear takes a cruel man and it draws the cruelty up to the surface where you can taste it, the way salt draws the water out of a hide. And by the time I was done with George Halbrook, done reading him, done letting him feel it close in, he was going to be the richest thing I had eaten in a lifetime of eating. He just had to understand it first. He had to turn all the way around and look. I gave him one more week of pretending. Then I stopped letting him pretend. The pretending broke on a Tuesday, though George could not have said the day. Time gets loose for a man once I am working on him. The mornings run together. He had stopped hunting the oak bench by then. He had stopped hunting anywhere near the Coldwater Road. He told his one client that week, a dentist down from Williamsport who had paid good money for a guided bear hunt, that the sign was poor this year and the bear had denned early, and he refunded the man half his deposit rather than take him up the mountain. And anyone who knew George would know what that cost him, because George had never in 22 years given $1 back to anybody for any reason. He was keeping the dentist off the mountain. He was keeping everybody off the mountain. Some part of him had decided, without ever saying it out loud, that what was up in Coldwater was up there for him, and that he was not going to hand it another man to practice on. And that was almost decent of him. It was the one time in his life he put another man's safety over his own money, and he did it for the wrong reason, out of a jealous animal knowing that the thing in the woods was his, but he did it. I have taken a great many men, and not one of them was only the worst thing he ever did. George had a scrap of something in him that could have been made into a man if the taste had not gotten into him so young, if the sad drunk father had been a little less sad and a little more father. It does not change what he was. It only means I did not enjoy it, if enjoy is even a word a thing like me can use. I do not enjoy. I fill, and then I empty, and in between I do the work. But there was a scrap in him, and it should be counted, so I count it. He went up the mountain that Tuesday with the rifle and a different plan. He had stopped running. A certain kind of hard man does that, and George was that kind under all the fear. You push him, and there comes a place in him where the pushing turns him around, and instead of the fear driving him down the mountain, it drives him up it, because a man like George would rather die hunting a thing than live running from it. He had spent a week feeling watched, feeling herded, feeling the country close around him, and somewhere in that week the fear had cooked down into a hard black anger, and he had decided he was going to go up into Coldwater and find the thing that was doing this to him, and put a 30-06 round through it and drag it down to the town square and show every soul in Mennig what had been living above their heads, the mighty hunter, come to hunt me. I let him. Of course I let him. It was the whole reason I had waited 39 years to have him come up the mountain after me with his rifle and his 30 years of woodcraft and his hard black certainty that he was the most dangerous thing in this country. I wanted him to spend it all. I wanted him to use every skill his father ever taught him, and find out at the bottom of all of it that his skills were things I had studied him learn, that I knew his still hunt and his stand and his read of the wind, because I had stood 11 yards behind him for 30 years while he practiced them, that a man cannot hunt the thing that taught itself his hunting by keeping to the trees behind him for 30 years. But he did not know that yet. He came up the grade in the dark that Tuesday full of purpose, and I moved out ahead of him into the high laurel, and I let him cut my track. That was a gift, the track. I do not leave sign unless I choose to. I can cross the country and write nothing on it, walk the bones of the ground where the snow does not take a print, and men have hunted me for 100 years and never found so much as a hair. But I left George a track that Tuesday because I wanted him up in the laurel where the country is worst, where a grown man cannot stand upright and the rhododendron grows so thick and low that you go through it on your hands and knees down, tunnels the deer have made, blind, with the snow coming down off the leaves onto the back of your neck, and your rifle useless in your hands, because there is no room to raise it, and nothing to see if you could. That is my country, the laurel. I wanted him in it, so I left him a track a child could follow, a long barefoot track in the snow at the edge of the laurel, left and right, a walking track, and I made the stride of it wrong on purpose, 7 feet and more between the prints, so that when George knelt down over the first one with his heart going and put his own boot beside it for the measure, the number would climb up into his head and sit there and not come out. He followed it in. He was brave, and that gets counted too. A man who follows a track like that into the laurel, into the blind wet dark of it, alone, is a brave man, or a man with nothing left to lose, and George was some of both by then. He went down onto his hands and knees at the edge of the laurel, and he pushed into the deer tunnels with the rifle slung across his back because there was no other way to carry it, and he crawled, and I let him crawl, and I moved around him in the thick of it. Close, so close, close enough that twice he stopped and went still, and I knew he could hear me, not moving, only there, the sound of something large, breathing in a place where nothing large should be able to move at all. Down in the laurel is where I let him hear the voices. I have a great many voices. I have collected them the way another thing might collect coins, one at a time, over a long time, and I keep every one, and I can put any of them on the way a man puts on a coat. In the laurel that Tuesday I gave George his father's voice first, his father dead 9 years, the sad drunk voice, and I said his name from off in the thick of the leaves, Georgie, the way only the father had ever said it, Georgie. And George stopped crawling and put his face down into the snow and made a sound I had waited a long time to hear a hard man make. Then I gave him other voices. I gave him the dentist from Williamsport, who I had never touched, whose voice I had lifted out of George's own memory of the man, because that is another power I have once I am deep enough into someone. I can reach into what they carry and wear the voices of people I have never met. I gave him voices he did not expect. And then, because I wanted him to understand, because the understanding was the point, I gave him the voice of his own wife. I said the thing she says, the small thing she says at night behind the last door, the please she says, the please that has no more hope left in it, that is not asking him to stop anymore because it stopped believing he would stop a long time ago. That is only a sound a person makes, the way you would flinch from a fire. I said it in her exact voice from 10 feet into the laurel in the dark, please, and I let George Halbrook hear his own house come out of the woods at him, and I felt the thing happen in him that I had come up the mountain to make happen. He understood. In that one moment, on his hands and knees in the wet dark with his wife's pleas coming at him out of the trees, George understood what had chosen him. He understood that the thing in the woods knew the last door of his house. He understood that whatever was hunting him had been to that house, had stood at the tree line behind it, had heard what happened in it, and had come for him because of it, and had come for him only. And a man does not get to think a thing like that and go on believing he is one of the good ones. The lie he had told the whole town, the lie he had half told himself, the wide, easy daylight lie came apart in the laurel that Tuesday, and under it was the true George, the George I had been hungry for since he was a boy, and the true George knelt in the snow and knew, for the first time and all at once, exactly what he was. Because the thing hunting him only hunted that. He did not shoot anything that day. He never got the rifle off his back. He crawled back out of the laurel the way he had come, hours later, in the last of the light, and he was not the same man who had crawled in. Something had gone out of his face. The hardness was still there, but it had nothing under it now, no certainty, no idea that the country was his. He knew whose country it was. He got to the truck in the dark, and he sat in it, and he did not drive home. He drove down to the bottom of the grade, and he stopped by the shut mine, and he got out, and he walked out onto the bald, warm ground of the cinders in the dark, out to where the steam came up out of the cracks. And he stood there a long time, in the one warm place in the cold country. And I stood at the edge of the hemlock, and saw him stand there, and I knew he had come to the cinders, because some part of him already understood that this was where it ended, that this warm, bald ground was the last of it. And he had come to look at the place the way a condemned man will ask to see the yard. He did not run after that. He had one thing left in him, one hard black scrap of the man he might have been, and it was not the sense to run. It was worse than that, for him. It was the decision to make me come and get him. He went home that night, and he did a thing he had never done. I was at the tree line behind the house, where I had stood on 100 nights, and I read it through the lit windows. He came in late, and the house went quiet, the way it always went quiet, his wife going still at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood the way a rabbit goes still, waiting to learn which George had come home. the daylight one, or the true one. And George stood in the kitchen doorway with the cold still coming off his coat, and he looked at her, and I saw him not do it. Whatever he did to her on the nights the truth was in him, he did not do it that night. He stood there, and he looked at her a long time, and then he went and sat in the front room in the dark by himself with the rifle across his knees, and he stayed there till morning. And she sat in the kitchen not daring to move, not understanding. And the porch light, for the first time in years, he had left it on. Do not make it more than it was. He did not leave the porch light on for her. He left it on because a man alone in the dark with a thing hunting him wants light, wants any light, wants the yard lit up so he can see it coming across the snow. And he did not spare her out of any softness that had grown up in him overnight. He spared her because he had finally understood what the thing in the woods was and what it fed on. And some cold, clever part of him had done the arithmetic and worked out that every cruelty was a thing the thing could taste, a thing that drew it closer. And George, in his fear, had decided to stop laying down a scent. It was not mercy. It was a hunted animal ceasing to leave a track. But she got a night of peace out of it either way, the first in a long time, and she did not know why, and she never would, and that is the way it always goes with what I do. The good that falls out of it falls off to the side and lands on people who will never know they were spared, and I get no credit and want none. I only wanted George. I had wanted George for 39 years, and George, sitting in the dark with the rifle and the porch light burning, had finally decided to give himself to me, though he thought he was deciding the opposite. In the gray of the morning he wrote his wife a note. I could not read it from the tree line, and I did not need to. I have taken enough men to know the kind of note a hard man writes at the end, when a soft one is not in him. It would have said something short. It would have said, "Do not come up the mountain looking for me." And it would have said, "Sell the truck." And it would not have said sorry, because sorry was a word that had rotted out of George a long time ago, and a man cannot write a word he no longer owns. He left the note on the kitchen table. He took the rifle and a box of shells, and he took the good knife his father had given him, and he drove up the Coldwater grade in the dark one last time. And he did not stop at the oak bench, and he did not stop at the laurel. He drove to the bottom of the mountain, and he parked by the shut mine, and he walked out onto the cinders to wait for me on the one piece of ground in all my country where nothing can come at a man unseen. It was clever, and it was the last true thing about George, and it earns its place here. He knew he could not fight me in the laurel, or the hemlock, or the black timber in the cover on my ground. So he took himself out onto the bald, warm dirt where the snow will not lie and there is no tree for 200 yards in any direction. And he set his back to the mouth of the old mine so that nothing could come at him from behind. And he sat down on a warm stone with the steam coming up around him out of the cracks and the rifle across his knees and a clear field of fire on every side. And he waited for the sun to come up so he could see me come. And I understood what he had done. He had made himself into a stand. 30 years of sitting still, in the cold, waiting for a thing to walk into the open where he could kill it. And at the end he had turned all of it around and made himself the hunter one last time, and made the whole open cinders his kill zone, and made me the deer that had to cross it, the mighty hunter. Even at the end, even knowing what he knew, I let him wait until the sun was full up. I wanted him to see. I have crossed a great deal of open ground in my long life, and I have learned that the open is not the safety men think it is. Men believe that what they can see cannot hurt them. It is one of the oldest lies men tell themselves, and George had built his whole last stand on it. He sat on the warm stone in the flat white morning light, with 200 yards of bare ground around him and the rifle up and ready, and he read the black wall of the hemlock at the edge of the cinders, every foot of it, turning his head slow and steady, the way a man reads a tree line he means to shoot something out of, and he was as ready as a man can be, and it did not matter at all, because I did not come out of the hemlock. I came out of the cinders. I had gone down into the warm dark, under the bald ground in the night, down into the burning veins of the mountain where nothing living can follow, and I had come up through a crack in the ground not 40 feet behind him, up out of the mouth of the old mine at his back where he had set his spine to feel safe. And the first George knew of it was the smell, the cooked stone sulphur smell of the deep fire, stronger all at once, and a warmth on the back of his neck that was not the steam. He came off that stone and around in one motion, 30 years of it, the rifle already coming up, and he was fast, he was so fast, and it did not matter. I was already crossing the ground between us. George saw how I crossed ground. In the last light of his life, he saw it. I do not run the way a man runs or a wolf runs. The strides are too long, and they come down too hard, and there is a wrongness in the tempo of it that unhinges the mind of whoever sees it. A sound of impacts spaced too far apart. The frozen ground shrieking under a weight that has no business moving that fast. And George heard it and saw it, and his hard woodsman's hands did the only thing 30 years had trained them to do. He shot me. He was a good shot. He put the first round into the center of me at 30 feet, and I heard it strike, and it was the sound of a round going into frozen wood, and it did nothing. He worked the bolt without thinking, the way a man breathes, and he put a second round into me, and a third, and I felt them the way you feel rain, and I did not slow. And the terror that came up in his face in that last second was the richest thing, the thing I had climbed up out of the fire for. The mighty hunter learning in one held breath that his skill was a thing I had seen him build, and that his rifle was a noise, and that the country had never once belonged to him. He got the fourth round chambered. He never fired it. I took him the way moving water takes a thing off a rock. One long reach, and he was gathered up against me off his feet, and the rifle went spinning away across the bald ground and lay there steaming where it fell. And I turned back toward the crack in the earth I had come up out of, and George Halbrook, 50 years old, the finest woodsman in the state, beloved of the whole town of Mennig, screamed in my grip in a voice I would keep now with all the others, and I carried him down out of the cold morning into the warm dark under the cinders, where the fire has been burning since before he was born, and will burn a long time after everyone who knew his name is gone. What happens down there is mine. I have given up a great deal here, more than I ever have, because George earned it. But what happens in the warm dark at the bottom is the one thing I keep, and I will keep it, and no one wants it anyway, whatever they think. They only think they do because they are clean, and the clean have never had to know. The truck sat by the shut mine for 2 days before anybody thought to wonder about it. It would have wounded George to know that, him who thought the whole town loved him. A man vanishes, and the world does not stop. The world barely slows. His wife found the note on the kitchen table the morning he left, and she did what the note said, which was nothing, which was, "Do not come up the mountain looking for me." And she sat in the quiet house with the note in her hands, and she waited. And what I saw in her through the window in those first days is the truest thing here and the hardest. And if a thing like me can be said to have looked away from anything at all, I looked away from this and made myself look back. She was not sad. She tried to be. She had been married to George for 26 years, and some deep-worn track in her kept trying to run the way it had always run, kept trying to feel the thing a wife is supposed to feel, and she could not make it come. She sat in the quiet house, and she waited for grief. And what came instead, slow, a little at a time over those first 2 days, rising up in her the way warmth rises into a room, when you finally get the fire to catch, was the most terrible and gentle thing I have ever seen come into a human face. It was relief. She did not have a name for it, and she would have been ashamed of it if she had, and she pushed it down, and it kept coming up, quiet and warm and enormous, the relief of a person who has lived a long time listening for boots on a porch and has just understood, without daring yet to believe it, that the boots are not coming up the drive tonight, or tomorrow night, or any night after. I got no part of that. I want to say it plainly one more time so there is no mistaking it. I did not take George to give her that. I took George because he was the richest meat this forest had grown in 40 years, and because I am hunger, and hunger takes what it can fill on. The relief that came up into that woman's face was nothing to do with me. It fell off the side of what I did, the way sparks fall off the side of a fire, and it landed on her, and I could not have stopped it landing on her any more than I made it land. And I stood at the tree line and saw it, and felt the one thing I am allowed to feel, which is hunger. And under the hunger, in a place I do not have a name for, and did not know I had until George, I felt the cold, enormous distance between what she was getting and what I am. She was getting free. I do not get free. I have never once in 1,000 winters been free of the wanting for the length of a single night. I took the one man in that county who could have been said to deserve the fire, and it filled me for less than a turn of the moon, and then I was empty again, and she goes on being free for the rest of her life, and there is no arithmetic in the world by which that is fair to a thing like me, and I would not change it, because I cannot, because I am what I am, and what I am does not get to want anything but the meat. They ran a search, of course. 2 days late, but they ran it. The county brought dogs up to the shut mine, and the dogs took George's scent off a shirt from his truck, and they ran it straight out onto the cinders, and then they stopped. All of them, at the same place, at the edge of the bald warm ground where the steam comes up. They would not go out onto it. One of them, a good young dog with a long nose, got 20 feet out onto the bare dirt, and then put its belly down in the warm ash and made a sound and backed off it, and would not be let out again. And the handler wrote in her report that the dog had refused due to ground heat and gas, and that was true, and it was not why. The dogs knew. The dogs always know. They stood at the edge of my country with their hackles up in a ridge from collar to tail, and they told the men in the only language they had that what they were being asked to follow had gone down into a place no dog and no man comes back out of, and the men did not have ears for that language, and they logged it as heat and gas, and they searched the hemlock and the laurel for a week for a body that was 200 feet under them in the warm dark, and then the snow came heavy and the search stood down, and George Halbrook went into the county's records as a missing person, presumed dead, foul play not suspected, and that was the end of the machinery of it. Then the forgetting started, and the forgetting is a thing I have seen 100 times, and it never gets less strange to me, how fast men do it, how they have to. For a month, George was the only thing the town of Mennig talked about. The finest woodsman in the state walked up into Coldwater and never walked out. And the theories ran wild. A bear, a fall down an old mine shaft, a heart give out on a cold morning somewhere the searchers missed. They held a service for him at the Methodist church with no body in the box, and the church was full, and men who had hunted with him stood up and told the wide, easy daylight stories. George laughing, George buying the Christmas tree, George never losing a client in 22 years, and every one of those men believed the man they were burying, because the daylight George was the only George they had ever been allowed to see. His wife sat in the front pew in a black dress and kept her face still and got through it, and only I knew what was behind the stillness, and it was not grief. And then, the way it always goes, the town went back to its living. The theories wore out. The service faded. By spring, George was a thing people said sometimes, shame about George, and by the next winter he was a thing people said once a season. You remember George Halbrook? Walked up into Coldwater, and that was the end of it, and the ones who said it shook their heads at the mystery of the woods and went on with the day. The county rounds its dead down. It does not mean to. It simply cannot carry all of them, and so it sets the older ones down, one at a time, the way you would set down a load you have carried too far, and George got set down like all the rest, and the boy came home from the service for the funeral and stood in the back of the church and did not cry, and then went back to his post, and I saw him go, and I was glad in my cold sideways way that he had been out from under that roof when it happened, that he was building a life somewhere. The last door of that house could not follow him, and I hope it holds. I do not get to hope, but I hope it holds for the boy. It is closer to a good wish than a thing like me has any right to come. I went back to the tree line behind the house once more, near the end of that first winter, though there was no reason to, though the man I had wanted was gone, and there was nothing there for me but the clean. I do not know why I went. Maybe a creature that has kept a tree line behind a house for as long as I kept, that one does not know how to stop all at once. The porch light was off, and inside, in the kitchen where she had spent 26 years going still at the sound of a truck, the woman was standing at the counter in the lamplight, with the radio going, an old song I will not name. And she was doing nothing, only standing there with her hands in the dishwater and her head tipped a little to the side listening to the radio. And there was a loose ease in her shoulders that had never once been in them on any night. I had kept the tree line behind that house, with George alive in it. She did not know I was in the trees. She would never know anything had been in the trees. She was only a woman washing dishes in a quiet house, humming, the way George used to hum over his kills, except that when she did it, there was nothing under it, nothing at all. And I stood in the cold and watched the one clean thing I would ever get no use from, and then I turned and went back down into the ground. The fill from George lasted 18 days. I counted them, the way I count everything, down in the warm dark under the ground, with the fire ticking along the veins of the mountain, and the taste of him going out of me a little at a time. 18 days of something that was almost enough, almost quiet, almost like what men mean when they say the word rest. 39 years of waiting and 18 days of near quiet at the end of it, and if that seems a poor trade, then something of what it is to be me has come clear at last. Nothing is ever enough. The richest meat this forest ever grew bought me 18 days, and on the 19th the wanting came back up out of the bottom of me, the way it always comes back, patient and total. And I went up out of the crack in the cinders into the cold, and I began, again, the only thing I have ever done. I began to read the country for the next one. Men never want to hear this, and it is the truest thing I know, and it belongs here at the end, because George bought it with 18 days of my quiet. The forest always has another one. Always. I have hunted this same country for longer than there has been a name for it, and I have never once had to hunt long for the meat I can fill on, because men grow it faithfully, generation on generation, in the warm-lit houses, with the porch lights off. It runs in some blood, and waits in some houses. I took George's grandfather off the reservoir ice in 1951, and I took George off the cinders in the cold light of a winter morning half a life later, and the taste in them was the same taste, come down through the blood, waiting in the boy the way it had waited in the man, and if that boy of George's had stayed under that roof one more year, I do not know that I could have kept from him either. Blood being what it is, houses being what they are, he got out. Most of them do not get out. Most of them grow up into the next George, into the next quiet house, the next flinch at the sound of boots, the next door that the whole street walks past never knowing what is behind it. And I stand at the tree line behind that door in the cold, reading, patient, and I wait. And sooner or later the country hands me another one, and it always does, and it always will, as long as there are men. Because the thing I hunger for is a thing men make in each other and pass down and never run out of. There is a house I have started watching. I will not give the road. It is not far from where George's truck sat by the shut mine, closer to town than that, a place with a light out front that used to burn all night and has lately started going dark early, and inside it a man who shakes every hand in Mennig with a grip that swallows yours, and a woman inside who has learned to go still at the sound of a truck in the drive, and the old taste is coming up in that man the way it came up in George. A little richer every season, curing in his own private dark the way a hide cures, and I have begun, on the cold nights, to learn his boot print and his truck and the way he reads a field. I am in no hurry. I am never in a hurry. I have all the winters there are. Some night, not this one, but some night when the meat is ripe and the fear has cured it through and the man has spent the last of himself pretending he is one of the good ones, I will stop letting him pretend. I will take the game out of his woods and the birds out of his hemlocks, and I will let the silence come down, and I will let him feel it start. The old thing at the edge of the country that he has always known was there and never turned all the way around to look at, and one morning he will turn around and look and he will understand all at once and too late exactly what he is, because I only hunt that, and then I will carry him down into the warm dark where nothing is ever found, and for a little while, 18 days, 20, I will be almost at rest. And in some quiet house, a light that used to go dark early will start burning all night again, and a person who has listened a long time for boots on a porch will lie in the dark and slowly understand that the boots are not coming, and will begin, without knowing why, without ever knowing why, to be free. They never know it was me. It is the whole shape of what I am, carried down 1,000 winters. I get the meat, and I get the 18 days, and then I get the wanting back. They get the freedom, and they never learn the name of the thing that bought it for them. And they would be right to be glad they never learn it, because the name is a cold thing, and it is a hungry thing, and it is coming, always, faithful as winter, for the worst of them, out of the warm dark, under the burning ground. And it is patient, and it can wait as long as it has to, and it has already begun to learn a neighbor's truck. The porch light down the road went dark early again tonight. I have been standing at the tree line behind it for a long time in the cold, reading, and the wanting is coming up in me the way it comes. And above the black line of the hemlock the moon is up, and it is a bad night for sleeping. And somewhere in that quiet house, a man who thinks the country belongs to him is about to make it go silent. Not yet, but soon. I have all the winters there are, and he is nearly ripe, and the fire under the cinders is warm, and I am so very hungry, and I have never once been kept from what I am owed. There is a truck and a drive down that road, and I have nearly learned it, and some cold morning it will cross the open ground toward me thinking it is the hunter, the way George crossed it, the way every one of them crosses it, and it will find out what I found out 1,000 winters ago, which is that in this country there has only ever been one hunter, and it was never the man with the rifle. The heart was still warm when I carried it up the hollow in the dark, and I kept thinking that was wrong, that a heart should have gone cold by the time a man walked it half a mile through the snow, and it had not. It sat in my two cupped hands, giving off its own heat like a stone out of a fire, and steam came off it into the cold, and I climbed the deer trail up toward the head of the hollow where the flat rock was, and I told myself the whole way that I was doing this because Walt would have wanted it, and for no other reason. Walt had been 3 weeks in the ground. He was my uncle, my father's older brother, and he had run the camp up Kessler Hollow for as long as I had been alive, and a good stretch before that. Heart got him, which some of the men thought was a joke the good Lord had made. Walt of all people. Walt who left a heart on the rock at the head of the hollow after every kill for 40 years, dropping dead of his own in the parking lot of the Weiss Market in Renovo with a bag of road salt in his hand. I did not think it was funny. I had loved him more than I loved my own father, who was a harder and smaller man. And when the lawyer read out that Walt had left me the camp, the deed and the lease and the wood stove, and the whole leaning half-rotted glory of it, I had gone out to my truck and sat in it in the funeral home lot and cried like a boy, which I had not done since I was one. I did not believe in the rock. Not that first morning, with the ground still fresh over Walt. I thought the rock was Walt. I thought it was the kind of thing an old man builds up around himself over a lifetime in the same woods, a ritual, a superstition, the way my grandmother would not let you put shoes on a table or open an umbrella in the house. Walt used to bring the heart up to that flat rock at the head of the hollow after every buck he killed, in the dark, alone, and he would not say much about it except that it was how his own uncle had run the camp, and that you leave the share, and that the woods eat first. I had heard him say the woods eat first 100 times across a hunting table with a beer in his hand, and I had never once taken it for anything but Walt talk. But he was dead, and it was my camp now, and I had killed the first buck of the first season without him, a heavy old 8-point that came down the far ridge into a drive we were pushing on opening morning. And when I had it gutted out on the snow, with the boys standing around telling me it was a good one, my hands had gone into the chest cavity and come out with the heart before I had decided to do anything at all. And I had wrapped it in a feed sack and told them I would be back. And I had walked off up the hollow alone in the dark with it, and not one of them said a word, because they had all watched Walt do the same thing for years, and I think it comforted them to see it done. It comforted me too. I did it because doing the thing Walt did made him feel less gone. The flat rock sat at the head of the hollow, where the ground pinched down between two ridges, and the last of the good timber gave way to the black tangle of the laurel that ran up over the top and down the far side into the state forest. Proper. It was granite gray, big as a kitchen table and near flat, and it had a shallow dish worn into the top of it that Walt always said was made by water, and that I understood later was not made by water. There was a smell up there that I put down to a deer carcass somewhere off in the laurel, a cold meat smell under the clean smell of the snow, and I knelt at the rock and set the heart down in the worn dish of it. And I did not know any words to say because Walt had never taught me any, and so I said the only thing I knew, which was what he used to say. The woods eat first. I said it out loud into the dark and felt like a fool saying it, and the hollow was quiet around me, and the heart steamed on the cold rock. And above me in the laurel where the deer smell was coming from, something shifted its weight. A man alone in the woods, in the dark, hears 100 things shift, and 99 of them are snow coming off a branch, or a limb cracking in the cold, or a deer moving off ahead of him. This was none of those. This was a weight. It was the sound a big animal makes when it has been standing still for a long time and moves one foot to stand more comfortably. A slow, settling shift, up in the laurel, not 40 feet above me. And it was heavy. Heavier than a deer, heavier than a bear. Ought to be that far, into December when the bears are down. I knelt there with my hands still on the rock, beside the steaming heart, and I did not move, and I did not breathe, and I waited for it to come again, and it did not. The hollow held still. After a while I stood up slow, and I backed off down the trail the way I had come, and I did not turn my back on the laurel until I was well down the hollow, and I told myself the whole way down that it was a bear. A late bear, a bear that had not denned, and by the time I got back to the fire and the boys and the buck hanging from the meat pole, I mostly believed it. None of the rest of it lands right without knowing what the camp was. It was not much to look at. A cinder block and clapboard box Walt and his own uncle had thrown up in the 50s. One long room with bunks along one wall, and a wood stove, and a plank table, and a meat pole out back under the eave. No running water. An outhouse, 50 feet up the slope, that you did not want to visit at 3 in the morning in January. Before generations of my family had killed their first buck out of that camp and hung it on that pole, and there were names carved in the doorframe going back to before I was born. And Walt's was the deepest of them, because Walt was the one who kept the place alive after everybody else got old or moved away or died. He worked at the paper mill in Johnsonburg his whole life, and he never had 2 nickels to rub together, and every dollar past the light bill he did not spend on that camp was a dollar I never saw him spend on anything. It was the one thing he had. It was the one thing he loved without complication, and when my own marriage came apart the year I turned 30 and I did not have anywhere to be that felt like anywhere, it was Walt who called me up and said, "Come up to camp." And I went, and I spent a whole autumn up there with him, just the two of us splitting wood and sitting by the stove. And he never once asked me what had happened with my wife, and I never once told him, and it was the closest I have ever felt to another human being in my life. So when I say I did not believe in the rock, it was tangled up with all of that. Walt was the rock, and the rock was Walt, and doing the thing he did was a way of keeping my hand on him a little while longer. I did not think there was anything up that hollow but an old man's habit, and my own grief looking for somewhere to put itself. I had knelt at that granite table 100 times in my head in the 3 weeks since the funeral, before I ever knelt at it for real, and every time it had been Walt I was kneeling for, not the thing Walt was feeding. That was the mistake. I mistook the man for the reason, and I mistook the habit for a comfort, and a thing that Walt had carried alone for 40 years, so that none of us would have to feel it. I picked up on that first cold morning like it was a keepsake, and I had no idea at all that I had just put my shoulder under something that had been waiting a long time for a new shoulder to lean on. The camp that year was 6 of us. There was old Renner, who was Walt's age, and had hunted that hollow near as long, a wide, slow man with a white mustache, who had been the first to shake my hand at the funeral and the first to say the camp should go on. There was my cousin Denny, my father's sister's boy, who I had grown up hunting beside and who ran a body shop down in Lock Haven. There was Denny's boy Kyle, 19 that year, up for his 3rd season. There was a fellow named Harlan Pyle who had married into Renner's family somewhere and come up with him for a dozen years, quiet, a good hand in the woods. And there was Boyd. Boyd is where it started, whatever I did or did not do after. Boyd Kettleman was a friend of Denny's from the body shop, a big blonde going to fat man of about 40 with a loud laugh and a way of filling a room, and he was a hell of a hunter. I will give him that in death the way I could barely stand to give it to him in life. He could shoot, he could read deer, he was tireless on a drive. He had come up to the camp the last 2 seasons as Denny's guest while Walt was alive, and Walt had not liked him, and Walt had never said why, and Walt was a man whose dislikes you took seriously, because he did not spend them cheap. Now Walt was gone, and it had somehow fallen out that Boyd was one of us, a regular, a man with a bunk, and I had not had the standing or the heart in that first raw season to say otherwise. So Boyd was in the camp, and Boyd thought the heart on the rock was the stupidest thing he had ever heard of. Boyd killed his buck on the 3rd day, and it was a bigger one than mine, a mainframe 10-point that field-dressed at better than 200 pounds, and he was still hollering about it when he dragged it into camp. It was a good deer, and he had made a good shot on it, a long one across a power line cut, and I would have been glad for him if it had been anybody else. We hung it on the meat pole next to mine and Renner's, and Boyd stood there admiring it with a beer in his hand, and Renner said to him, "Easy, not making anything of it," that the head of the hollow was up past the spring seep, and he could walk the heart up before dark if he wanted a hand finding the rock. Boyd laughed. I remember exactly how he laughed, because I have thought about it more nights than I would like. He laughed the way a man laughs when he has decided the people around him are simple, a big generous laugh with contempt folded down inside it where he thought it did not show. He said he was not going to walk good meat half a mile up a hollow in the dark to leave it out for the coyotes. He said the heart was the best eating on the animal if you knew how to do it, and that his grandmother had fried heart and onions, and he was not about to feed his to a rock because a bunch of old-timers had a story about it. He said all of this friendly grinning, and he clapped Renner on the shoulder while he said it, and Renner did not grin back. Renner looked at him for a second with his pale old eyes, and then Renner looked at. That was the moment, if there was one. That was where I could have been Walt. Walt would have told Boyd to leave the share or leave the camp, and he would have said it flat and quiet across the meat pole, and it would have been the end of it. Because Walt had 30 years of standing in that hollow, and every man there would have backed him. I had 3 days of standing and a dead uncle and a skepticism of my own that I had not shaken, because part of me was standing there thinking Boyd was right, that it was a story, that grown men walking hearts up a hill in the dark was exactly the kind of thing a man like Boyd should laugh at. So I did not say what Walt would have said. I mumbled about how it was just how we ran the camp and left it at that week, and Boyd said, sure, no offense. And he took his buck's heart down to the creek and he cleaned it, and he fried it that night in the camp skillet with an onion, and the cabin filled up with the smell of it, and I ate my dinner and did not say anything, and Renner went to bed early. The next morning, the hollow was quiet. I do not mean it was peaceful. I mean the sound had gone out of it. I was up before the others the way I always am, out at the fire ring with my coffee in the blue dark before dawn, and I stood there and I could not place what was wrong until I had been standing a while. And then I had it. There were no birds. Kessler Hollow in December was chickadee country. Juncos, the little winter birds always working the hemlocks and the brush along the creek, and there was always the sound of them starting up before light. And that morning there was nothing. Not one. The creek ran, and the fire ticked, and beyond that the hollow was as silent as a room with the door shut. I stood out there with my coffee going cold, and I turned a slow circle looking up at the black ridges on both sides. And the silence had a quality to it that I did not have a word for then, and do not much want to use now, which is that it felt like being looked at. The deer were gone, too. We found that out over the next 2 days. That hollow had held deer the way a good hollow does. We had been into them every drive, and now the drives came up empty. All of them. The fresh sign gone, the trails filling with old snow. The beds, we knew, cold and abandoned. Renner walked the whole lower hollow the second day and came back and said there was not a track in it under a week old. And he said it looking at me, not at Boyd. And I understood that Renner had a whole set of beliefs about what was happening and was too old and too proud to say them out loud to a man who would only half listen. On the fourth morning after Boyd fried his heart, I walked up to the rock. I do not know entirely why I went. I told myself I was going to leave my own share right, to make up for Boyd, though I did not have a fresh kill and did not know what you were supposed to leave in that case, and I brought a good cut of backstrap off my own buck wrapped in a sack, thinking that would do. I went up in the gray before light, up past the spring seep, up the deer trail to the pinch at the head of the hollow, and I came up on the flat rock. And I stopped at the edge of the clearing, and I did not go any closer, because there was something on the rock. The heart I had left 4 days before was gone. That did not surprise me. A heart left out 4 days, coyotes would have it, or a fox, or the ravens. What stopped me was the rock itself. The worn dish in the top of it, where I had set it, was clean. Not picked at, not scattered, not left with the mess and animal leaves. It was clean the way a plate is clean when someone has wiped it. A wet dark shine to the granite in the dish and nowhere else, and around the clean dish, in the skiff of new snow that lay over the rest of the rock, there were no tracks. No fox, no coyote, no raven. Nothing had walked up onto that rock across the snow to clean the dish. The snow lay smooth to the edges of the stone on every side, unbroken, and the dish in the middle of it was licked clean and shining. And I stood at the edge of the clearing with the backstrap in my hands, and I could not make those two things fit together in any way that let me walk forward and set the meat down. So I set it down at the edge of the clearing instead, at the foot of a hemlock, 10 feet short of the rock, which I knew even as I did it was not right, was not the share, was a coward's half measure, and I backed off down the hollow again the way I had the first morning, not turning my back on the rock, and the smell was up there again, the cold meat smell, stronger than before, and this time under it there was something else, a dry burnt smell with no smoke in it, like a wood stove that has been cold for a week, and I did not stay to place it, the shape I saw that evening. We ran one more drive that day, a long one down the far side of the hollow toward the state forest line, and it came up empty like all the rest, and we were strung out across the slope pushing down toward the standers. 6 of us in a line maybe 40 yards apart, orange coats moving down through the gray timber, and I was on the high end of the line nearest the laurel. I do not know what made me look up the slope into the laurel. Nothing that I could name. But I looked, and up at the top of the drive where the good timber gave way to the black tangle, standing between 2 hemlocks at the very edge of the laurel, there was a shape. I took it for a stander at first, one of us, somebody who had gotten turned around and come up too high, and I almost raised my hand to it. Then I understood it was too tall. It stood a head and shoulders above where a tall man's head would have been against those hemlocks, and it was thin, wrong thin for its height, a long vertical dark, standing dead still in the shadow of the laurel edge, and it was not looking down the slope where the drive was pushing. It was looking along the line. I watched it turn its head, slow, and go down the row of us 1 orange coat at a time, from Renner on the low end up the slope toward me, and I felt its attention arrive at me the way you feel the sun come out from behind a cloud on the back of your neck and then it moved on past me, and there was no more line to look at, and it stood there having counted us. 6. It had counted us, one at a time, and then it stood still, and I stood still, 40 yards below it, and neither of us moved, and then Denny called out from down the line asking was I coming, and I looked down at him for the half second it took to answer, and when I looked back up, the laurel edge held 2 hemlocks, and the black tangle, and nothing else. I did not tell the others what I had seen. I told myself it was because they would not believe me, and there was truth in that, but the deeper truth is that saying it out loud would have made it real, and I was not ready for it to be real. So I finished the drive, and I ate my dinner, and I lay in my bunk that night in the dark, listening to 5 men breathe, and I did not sleep, and sometime in the small hours I heard it come down the hollow. It did not come all the way to the camp. The distances were part of how it worked on a man. It came down out of the laurel to somewhere above the spring seep, a few hundred yards up, and then it stopped, and for the rest of that night it stayed up there, and it made a sound. Not a call, not yet, not the voices that came later, just a sound, low and patient and enormous, that I felt in the floor of the cabin more than I heard with my ears, a slow working sound with a wet edge to it, and it took me most of the night to understand what it was, and when I understood it, I wished I had not. It was the sound of something chewing. Up the hollow, in the dark, unhurried, all night long, a thing the size of the thing I had seen at the top of the drive was working its jaws on whatever it had, and the only thing up that hollow to work its jaws on was whatever it had cleaned off the rock, and there had been nothing on the rock but a heart 4 days gone, and the backstrap I had set at the foot of a hemlock 10 feet short. It was eating the coward's half measure I had left. It had come down to collect the little I had been willing to give, and it was letting me lie there in my bunk and listen to it eat, and I understood, lying there, that it was not satisfied, that a half measure was worse than nothing, because a half measure told it exactly how much it was being cheated, and I lay awake until dawn doing sums in my head that all came out the same way, which was that a debt was building up the hollow, and my family's rock was the ledger it was being kept on. In the morning, Boyd asked if anybody else had heard the bear. He said it grinning, needling, and Renner set down his coffee and looked at Boyd across the fire ring for a long moment and said, "That is no bear, Boyd, and you know it is no bear, and if you had the sense God gave a goose, you would have left your heart on that rock." And Boyd laughed it off the way he laughed everything off, but I saw something go across his face before the laugh got there, just for a second, and it was the first crack in him, the first hint that some animal part of Boyd Kettleman had lain awake in the night too, listening to that patient wet chewing up the hollow, and had known, the way the body knows things the mouth will not say, exactly what kind of thing was up there, and exactly whose fault it was that it had come down. That was the morning I drove down to Merle Kessler's, and I did not tell the others where I was going. Merle Kessler lived in a blockhouse at the mouth of the hollow, on the last piece of the old family ground his people had held on to after the state took the rest for the forest. He was past 80. His family had been up that hollow before Walt's people ever leased the campground, before the state forest had a name, and the hollow carried the family name, because they had been the first to try to live in it and the last to give up on it. I had known Merle my whole life, the way you know an old man at the edge of things, a wave from the road, a nod at the feed store, and I had never once been inside his house until the morning after I saw the shape count our line. I went down there because I could not think of anywhere else to go with what was in my head, and because some part of me had started to understand that the oldest man at the mouth of the oldest ground was the man who would know, if anybody living knew. He came to the door before I knocked. He looked at my face, and he did not ask me what I wanted. He said, "Come in out of the cold," and he put coffee on, and he sat me down at a kitchen table with a plastic cloth on it and a window over the sink that looked straight up the hollow toward the head of it, and he sat down across from me, and he said, "Somebody kept a heart back." I had not said a word. I told him yes. I told him about Boyd, about the 10-point, about the skillet, about the 4 days, about the rock licked clean with no tracks in the snow, about the shape at the top of the drive counting us down the line. Merle listened to all of it with his hands flat on the plastic cloth and his eyes going every so often to that window over the sink, up the white throat of the hollow. And when I was done, he was quiet for a while. And then he told me what his grandfather had told him. And I am going to give it to you close to the way he gave it to me, because it was not a story the way I had always taken Walt's Rock for a story. It was closer to a set of instructions, and he told it like a man handing me a loaded thing. There had been a winter, he said, a long way back, before his grandfather's time, back when the first families were trying to make a go of the hollows in that country, and the winters were harder than anything we would know. There had been a starving. He did not put a year on it, and I did not ask for one. A whole winter of it, snow to the eaves, and the game gone, and the roads shut, and no help coming, and the people up the hollows had come to the end of what a person can eat and gone past it, and one of them, up at the head of Kessler Hollow, where the flat rock was, had done the thing that a starving person can do at the very end, the thing that cannot be taken back, and had become something on the far side of it. Merle would not say the word for what the man became. He told me that plainly and without drama, the way you would tell a stranger a road was washed out ahead. He said his people did not say its name with snow on the ground. He said you could say it in July if you were fool enough, and it would not matter in July, but you did not say it in winter within a day's walk of that hollow, and he was not going to, and I should not either. So I do not have the word to give you, and I would not give it if I did. What he gave me instead was the shape of the arrangement, because there was an arrangement, and Walt had been keeping his end of it for 40 years, and I had watched him do it and thought it was an old man being funny. The thing at the head of the hollow does not go away, and cannot be made to go away, and cannot, Merle said, be killed by anything he ever heard of except the one thing, which he would come to. It stays. It owns that hollow the way a hard old landlord owns a house, and it is always hungry, because the hunger is what it is made of, and it will take what it is owed out of that hollow one way or the other. The people who stayed in that country learned the only thing that ever worked, which was to pay it first. You leave the share, you bring the heart up to the rock after every kill, and you leave a portion of the meat besides, and you say the woods eat first, and you mean it, and if you do that faithfully every time, it takes its share off the rock, and it lets the deer be, and it lets the men be. It eats what you give it, and it stays fed, and it stays quiet. That was the whole of the covenant, and it was the thing Walt had been doing in the dark all those years, keeping a camp full of men safe with a heart on a rock, and none of us young ones had ever understood that the safety was a thing he was buying. And if you keep the share back, Merle said, if you take what is the woods portion, and you fry it in a skillet, and you feed it to yourself, and you laugh about it, then the thing is owed, and it collects. It does not forget, and it does not forgive, and it does not care which of you did it. It is owed a share out of that hollow, and it will take a share out of that hollow, and if you did not leave it on the rock, then it comes down and takes it out of the camp, and it takes it in the coin it likes best, which is not venison. Merle looked at me across the plastic tablecloth when he said that part, and he did not spell it out any further, and he did not need to, because I had knelt at that rock and seen the dish licked clean, and understood already, somewhere under my skepticism, what kind of appetite I was dealing with. I asked him what to do. He said, pay it. Pay it now, and pay it heavy, more than the share Boyd kept back, and pay it every day until the season closed, and every season after, for as long as I meant to keep the camp. And he said, even then, it might be too late for this year, because it had already come down the hollow and counted the men, and once it has counted them, it has decided what it is owed, and a thing like that does not undecide. He said, get them out of the hollow if I could. He said, the ones who would not go, keep them close and keep them together, and do not let a man be alone up there after dark, not for any reason, because it works in the dark, and it works on a man by himself. And it can call, he said. It can call in a voice, you know, and a man who follows a voice he knows up that hollow in the dark by himself does not come back down it. And then Merle looked out the window over the sink at the white hollow one more time, and he said the last thing, which was that if it came to the worst, if it got in among us and started taking, then the only thing his grandfather ever knew to end it was fire. A fire big enough and hot enough that it could not walk out of, and that a man would have to get it into such a fire, and that no one he ever heard of had done that and lived. Then he poured me more coffee I did not drink, and I went back up to the camp to try to get 6 grown men to leave a deer camp 3 days before the end of the season, on the word of an old man and a shape in the trees. They would not go. Denny half believed me. I could see it in his face, but Denny had Kyle to think about and a body shop to get back to, and he took the practical view, which was that a bad smell and some spooked deer and a tall snag in the laurel that looked like a man in bad light did not add up to breaking camp. Renner believed me all the way. Renner had believed it before I did, but Renner was 76 years old and stubborn as the granite, and he said his answer to it was to go up and pay the rock right tonight, the way Walt would have, and that running from it had never once been the family way, and he was too old to start. Boyd thought the whole thing was the funniest business he had heard in years, and he said so, and he made a crack about the rock being hungry that got Kyle to laugh before Denny cuffed the boy quiet, and Harlan Pyle did not say anything at all. Harlan just listened, the way he always did, quiet at the edge of it, and I did not read anything into his quiet at the time. I have since. Harlan was the one who went up the hollow that night. Harlan was the first. I woke sometime after 2 in the morning because the cold had changed. That is the only way I know to say it. The stove had burned down, and the cabin had gone the deep cold. It goes in the small hours, and something in the quality of the cold had woken me, and I lay in my bunk listening, and I heard the cabin door standing open. Not banging, open, a steady draw of outside air across the floor, and the small sounds of the winter night coming in through it, and I got up, and there was Harlan Pyle's bunk empty, the blanket folded back neat, his boots gone from under it, and the door standing open on the dark, with the snow starting to come down out of it, and no Harlan. I did not go straight out after him. I stood in that open door, in my long johns, with the snow coming in past me onto the floor, and I was afraid in a way I had never been afraid in my life. A childhood kind of afraid, the kind where your body will not do what you tell it, and by the time I got the others up and got boots and lights on us and got out into the yard, there was no Harlan in the yard and no answer when we called, and the snow was coming harder, and up the hollow, a long way up toward the head of it, once. We heard him. We heard Harlan Pyle call out. It was his voice. Denny swore it was his voice, and Kyle started to cry, and Renner stood still and said it was not, said, "Do not any of you go up there," said it in a voice I had never heard the old man use. And we stood in the falling snow, in the dark, arguing about whether to follow the sound of a man we all knew, calling for help from up the black hollow. And while we argued, it came again, farther up, and then it did not come any more. We found him at first light, when the snow had let off enough to move. He was up at the head of the hollow, near the rock, and I am not going to describe what the woods had taken, because it does not need describing, and because I still have to close my eyes at night, and some things a man keeps. He was laid out neat, and the part of him the arrangement was owed was gone, cleanly, and the dish in the top of the rock was not clean any more. Renner, who had seen 2 wars, turned away from it, and put his hand on a hemlock and stood there with his back to us, and his shoulders going, and that Boyd Kettleman, who had laughed at all of it for a solid week, did not laugh. Boyd stood over what was left of Harlan Pyle, and the color went out of his big red face all at once, and I watched him understand, finally, 3 days too late and 1 man short, exactly what his fried heart and onion had cost, and I could have felt some satisfaction watching Boyd understand, and I did not. I felt sick, and I felt it was my fault, as much as his, because I was the one who had inherited the rock and the knowing of it, and I had let a guest laugh me out of keeping it. After that they wanted to leave, all of them, even Renner, though Renner wanted to pay the rock first. But leaving was not the simple thing it should have been, because the storm that had started when Harlan went out the door had settled in over the whole plateau, a real one, afoot and climbing with the wind stacking it into drifts, and the camp road ran 2 miles down the hollow to the state road, and the camp road was gone. Drifted in over the hood in 3 places we knew of, and God knew how many we did not, and Denny's truck and mine were the only 2 rigs that would even have tried it, and neither would have made the first drift. We were snowed in. We were snowed in at a deer camp, with a dead man wrapped in a tarp on the porch, and a thing at the head of the hollow that was still. Merle had told me, Ode, and the radio said the storm would not break until the following night, and the sun was already going down on the shortest day of the year. The daylight hours before we went up were their own kind of bad. There is a thing that happens to men who have been made afraid and cannot run and have nothing to do with the fear, and it is not the thing anyone expects. Nobody raged. Nobody fell apart loud. We got quiet, and we got busy, and we got careful with each other, the way people are at a hospital. Denny and I moved Harlan off the porch into the woodshed and covered him proper, because leaving a man you knew under a tarp where you had to pass him was more than any of us could keep doing. And while we did it, neither of us said a word about the state of him, and neither of us has to this day. Renner sat inside and cleaned every gun in the camp, slow, over and over, not because the guns were dirty, and not because they would help, but because it gave his old hands a thing to do that was not shaking. Kyle would not leave the stove. The boy sat as close to the fire as he could get without climbing into it, and he watched the door, and every so often his lips moved, and I understood he was praying. 19 years old and praying by a wood stove in the middle of the day, and I did not have the heart or the standing to tell him it would not help, because I did not know that it would not. It was Boyd I watched, though. Boyd had gone somewhere inside himself that morning at the rock, over the ruin of Harlan Pile, and he had not come back out. The loud was gone out of him all at once, and completely, the way air goes out of a thing, and what was left was worse to be around than the loud had ever been. He sat on his bunk with his back against the wall and his knees up, and he stared at nothing, and once near midday he started to talk, low, not to any of us. He said he had eaten it. He said it 2 or 3 times. Quiet, he had eaten it. He had eaten the heart, like a man turning over the one fact that had broken his whole picture of the world. And Denny went and sat by him and told him to hush, that it was nobody's fault, which was a kindness and a lie. And Boyd looked at Denny with an expression I had never seen on that big loud face, and said, "It knows my name now." And none of us asked him how he knew that, because none of us wanted the answer, and because some part of every man in that room had lain awake the same nights Boyd had, and knew that he was right. Around 2 in the afternoon, with maybe 2 hours of gray light left, the dog started. Not a real dog. Renner had an old beagle named Sadie that rode up to camp with him every year and slept under his bunk. A fat, gentle thing that had never in her life been anything but glad to see a person. And Sadie came out from under the bunk, stiff-legged, with every hair on her back standing up, and she faced the door, and she made a sound I did not know. A beagle could make, low, from the chest. And then she backed into the corner behind the stove, and would not come out, and would not stop shaking. I went to the window, out past the meat pole, at the edge of the yard, where the mowed ground gave way to the timber, in the flat gray light of the middle of the day. It was standing between 2 trees at the tree line, watching the cabin. In daylight, it had never come to the camp in daylight, and here it was at the edge of the yard, in the low gray afternoon, tall and thin and wrong against the trunks, not moving. And I stood at the window with my heart going, and I understood that it was done waiting up the hollow for us to bring the share. It had come down to the house, and I understood that when the dark came, in a couple of hours it would come the rest of the way, and that between now and then a man had better go up to the rock and pay it everything he had, and that the man had better be me. Renner and I went up to the rock in the last light to pay it. I did not want to. Every part of me that had spent a week being afraid did not want to go up that hollow toward the thing as the dark came down, but Renner was going with or without me, and I could not let the old man go alone. And some harder thing in me had also decided that this was mine to do, that Walt had left me the rock, and I had failed it once, and a man who fails a thing like that had better not fail it twice. So we took the hearts. We took the hearts out of the 2 bucks still hanging on the meat pole, mine and Renner's, and we took the good meat off 'em, besides the back straps and the hams, everything, loaded into 2 feed sacks heavy enough that we had to stop and rest going up. And we carried the share up the hollow through the drifting snow in the blue dark, paying with everything we had, paying heavy the way Merle said, and the smell got stronger the higher we went. The cold meat smell and the dry burnt smell under it, and the hollow was silent around us except our own breathing and the crunch of the snow. It was at the rock. We came up to the pinch at the head of the hollow, and it was standing at the rock on the far side of it. And this time there was light enough left to see it, and I can hold on to only the little of it. It was tall the way I had guessed from the drive, and taller, and it was thin over that height in a way that hurt to look at, the bones of it too long and too many, and it stood the way a starved thing stands, and where its face should have been catching the last of the light, there was only a dark shape, and 2 places in the dark shape where the light stood in its eyes, the way light stands on ice. It did not come at us. It watched us come, the way it had watched the line. And Renner stopped 10 feet short of the rock, and I stopped beside him. And Renner, 76 years old, took the heart out of his sack in his bare old hands, and he set it in the dish of the rock, and he said the words, "The woods eat first." And his voice did not shake, and I did the same beside him, mine into the dish next to his. The woods eat first, and then we emptied the sacks, all of it, all the meat we had, onto the rock and around it, and we backed away. And the thing on the far side of the rock never moved, and its eyes went from Renner to me and back, and I understood it was still counting, still deciding whether what we had brought was enough, and I did not know the answer, and neither did it seem to, and we backed all the way to the trail, and turned and went down the hollow in the full dark with our empty sacks, and it let us go. Boyd was gone when we got back. I have never been able to square that, and I have stopped trying. We had left 4 men at the cabin, Denny and Kyle and Boyd and Harlan's body on the porch, and we came down out of the hollow, having paid the rock with everything we had, and Denny met us in the yard, white as the snow, saying Boyd had walked out, not been taken from his bunk in the night. Walked out in front of them an hour after dark, while Renner and I were up at the rock. Denny said Boyd had gone quiet and strange after we left, sat by the stove, not talking, and then Boyd had stood up in the middle of Kyle saying something to him, and had walked to the door and opened it, and Denny had asked him where the hell he thought he was going, and Boyd had said, easy, like it was nothing, that his grandmother was calling him, that couldn't they hear her, she was right up the hollow, calling him for supper. And he had walked out into the dark and the snow toward the head of the hollow, and Denny had gone after him as far as the tree line and lost him in the storm and been too afraid to go further, and had come back, and that was hours ago now, and there had been no sound since. Boyd Kettleman's grandmother, who fried heart and onions, who he had bragged about over the meat pole the day he kept the share back, had been dead for 20 years. We did not go after Boyd. God forgive me, and I have asked him to more than once. We did not go up that hollow after Boyd Kettleman in the dark, because Merle had told me what happens to a man who follows a voice up that hollow at night, and because Harlan Pyle was already wrapped in a tarp on the porch as the price of the last time we did not listen to Merle. So we did the other thing Merle had told me. We kept together. The 4 of us that were left, me and Renner and Denny and the boy Kyle, we built the stove up hot, and we sat the whole night in the one room with every lamp we had going and the doors barred, and we did not let a man step out to the outhouse alone, and we did not sleep, and we listened. It called for most of the night. It called in Boyd's voice first, out in the storm, close and then far and then close again. Boyd's big laugh turned into something that was asking to be let in, and Kyle put his hands over his ears, and Denny held on to the boy, and Renner sat by the door with Walt's old lever gun across his knees, Not because a gun was any use. We all knew by then a gun was no use. But because a man holds something in his hands on a night like that, then it called in other voices. It called in Harlan's voice. From the porch, from right out where the body lay, and that was the worst hour of my life, and I will leave it at that. Near morning it called in Walt's voice. My uncle, dead a month, calling my name from up the hollow the way he used to call it across the deer woods when I was a boy. And I sat there in the lamplight with tears running down my face, and Renner reached over without a word and put his old hand flat on my chest and held it there the way you would hold a door, and I did not go. The woods eat first. I said it to myself over and over in the lamplight while my dead uncle called my name out of the dark. The woods eat first. I had paid it. I had paid it heavy at the rock. I would not pay it myself. On top of that. And whether it was the paying or whether it had simply taken the count it had decided on, Harlan for the share and Boyd for the greed, 2 men out of the hollow the way was owed to, I do not know. But as the black outside the windows went to gray, the calling stopped, and it did not come again, and the storm broke a little after noon. It took us the rest of that day and part of the next to dig out. We got my truck through to Merle's at the mouth of the hollow, breaking drifts the whole way with Denny and Kyle on shovels ahead of the bumper, and we carried Harlan Pyle out wrapped in his tarp in the bed of it, and we never did find Boyd. I told the state police that Boyd had wandered off in the storm, which was true, every word of it true, and they ran a search up the hollow when the weather allowed, dogs and a helicopter and 30 men in a line, and the dogs would not work the head of the hollow, and the line of 30 men walked right past the flat rock and never gave it a look, and they found nothing. And Boyd Kettleman went into the county records as lost in a blizzard, presumed dead, body unrecovered. And that was the truth too, and it was not the truth at all, and I have learned to live in the gap between those two things. Merle was on his porch when we came down out of the hollow with Harlan in the truck. He did not come out to the vehicle. He stood on his porch in the cold with a blanket over his shoulders, and he watched us come down. An old man at the mouth of the ground his family had been the first to bleed on. And when I stopped the truck and rolled the window down, he looked at the tarp in the bed, and then he looked at me, and he asked how many. I said 2. I said we paid the rock and it took 2. And Merle nodded slow, like a man hearing a bill come out close to what he had guessed, and he said that 2 was what a kept back share and a fried heart cost, more or less, and that we were lucky it was not 4, and that Walt would have kept it from being any, and that I had best learn to keep it the way Walt did if I meant to hold that camp. Then he told me to bring the body on down to the church and not to say the word to anyone, and he went inside out of the cold. And that was the last long talk I ever had with Merle Kessler, who died in his sleep the following autumn, before the season, which I have always been grateful for, because it meant he went out of this world in a month with no snow on the ground. I have kept the camp 7 seasons since that one, and I have kept the rock every one of them, and keeping it has taught me things Walt never got the chance to, and somebody in the family will have to know them after I am gone. It is not a thing you appease. I understood it that way at first, the way you would understand paying off a debt or making peace with an angry neighbor, and I was wrong, and the wrongness of it took me a few seasons to feel all the way down. You do not pay the rock in square accounts and earn your safety. There is no square. The thing at the head of Kessler Hollow is not owed a finite sum that a man can pay down to 0 and be free of. It is hungry the way the winter is cold, which is to say, it is hungry as a condition of what it is, always, with no bottom to it, and the share is not a debt you retire, the share is rent. You pay it, and you pay it, and you pay it, every kill, every season, for as long as you set foot in that hollow, and what you are buying is not freedom and not forgiveness. What you are buying is one more turn, of one more season, in which it takes a deer's heart off a rock, instead of coming down the hollow after yours. That is all. That is the whole of the arrangement, and Walt knew it for 40 years, and carried it alone in the dark, and let us all think he was a sweet old eccentric with a superstition. And I understand now that the walking off up the hollow alone after every kill was Walt shouldering a thing so the rest of us would not have to know it was there. So I carry it now. Every buck any man takes in that camp, I take the heart up to the rock myself, in the dark, alone, the way Walt did, and I have taught the men that this is simply how our camp is run, and the ones who ask why get the same answer Walt gave, which is nothing much, which is that you leave the share that the woods eat first. I have not told any of them the rest of it. I run the camp the way Walt ran it instead, which is to say, I keep the rule and I do not explain it, and the one time it was tested, I did the thing I had failed to do for Boyd. 3 seasons back, a young fellow Kyle's age, a new man, a nephew of Renner's, brought up to fill a bunk, took his first buck ever off that hollow, and was so lit up about it that he wanted to keep it to show his father, and he said so at the meat pole, grinning the way Boyd had grinned. And I did not go weak on him the way I had gone weak on Boyd. I took the boy by the arm, and I walked him away from the pole where the others could not hear, and I told him, flat and quiet, that in this camp the heart goes up on the rock, every time, no exceptions, that his father could see a photograph, and that if he could not live with that, he could pack his gear, and I would drive him down to the state road myself in the morning with no hard feelings. And the boy looked at my face, and something in it stopped his grin, because I think whatever Walt used to put in his face when he said a thing like that had gotten into mine over the years without my knowing. And the boy said, "Yes, sir," and carried his own heart up to the rock that night with me walking behind him. And I taught him the words, and he has kept the rule every season since, and never once asked me why. And that is how it is supposed to go. That is how you hold a camp on that ground. You do not explain it, you just never ever let it slide. Denny knows, because Denny was there, and Denny has never come back to the camp, not once in 7 years, and I do not hold it against him. Kyle knows, and Kyle is a grown man now with troubles of his own that I think started that night in the lamplight, and he does not come back either. Renner came back. Renner came back every season until his knees gave out 2 years ago. And Renner and I never once spoke of it out loud after that winter. But there were mornings the two of us would meet at the fire ring in the blue dark, before the others were up. And the old man would look at me over his coffee and I would nod. And that was the whole conversation, and it said everything. Renner is in the county home now over in Coudersport, and does not always know me when I visit, but he knew me last time long enough to take my hand and say, "Keep the rock," and I said I would, and I will. I have learned something Merle did not tell me, that maybe Merle did not know, that maybe only a man who keeps it year on year comes to feel. It is getting to know me. The way I got to know that hollow over a lifetime, its trails and its seeps and its deer, the thing at the head of it is coming to know me, the man who brings the share now, and I do not think that is a comfort. And I have stopped pretending it might be. Some mornings when I go up in the dark to leave a heart, the smell is waiting for me before I reach the rock, closer down the hollow than it used to come, as if it heard me start up the trail and move to meet me. Some mornings the shape is at the laurel edge when I get there, not close, never close, but there, standing, and it does not count me anymore, because it knows there is only one of me, and it knows my face, and it just watches me set the share in the dish and back away, and once, only once, a morning 2 winters ago with the light barely up, as I was backing off down the trail, it made a sound at me, low, in the throat. I have gone over and over what that sound was, and the nearest I can come is that it was the sound a hard old landlord makes when the rent is in his hand, and he is letting you know, without words, that he has seen you, and that he could always decide otherwise. It was not a threat. It was worse than a threat. It was acknowledgement. It knew me, and it wanted me to know that it knew me, and then it let me go back down to my camp and my fire and my men. And there is the last thing, the thing I have told no one, the thing that keeps me awake some nights in the off-season with the windows open to the summer and no snow anywhere for 100 miles. 3 times now, over 7 years, I have gone up to the rock in the dark to leave the share, and the dish has already been clean. Wet and clean and shining in my headlamp, licked out, with no track in the snow around it, on a morning when I had left nothing there the night before, when no man in my camp had killed anything in days. when there was nothing owed and nothing paid. The share collected on a debt that did not exist. The first time I told myself an animal had gotten up there, and I knew, even as I told it, that no animal cleans a stone dish and leaves no track. The second time, I stood at the edge of the clearing in the dark, and I understood what it meant, and I have understood it a little worse each time it has happened since, which is that the arrangement has begun to change. It is not waiting to be paid anymore. It has started on its own mornings to help itself, to remind me, maybe, that the rock is its rock and the hollow is its hollow, and the share is a courtesy it extends to me and not a right I have purchased, and that a landlord who can let himself in does not, in the end, need the tenant at all. I still go up. Every kill, every season, in the dark, alone, the heart in my two hands giving off its heat, up the deer trail, to the flat rock at the head of the hollow where the ground pinches down and the good timber gives way to the black laurel. And I set the share in the dish, and I say the words my uncle said. And I back away down the trail without turning my back on it. And I keep my men close, and I do not let one of them go up that hollow alone in the dark for any reason, ever. And I have not lost another one. And I tell myself, that is the arrangement holding. Some mornings I almost believe it. Then there is a morning when the dish is already clean, and the smell comes down the trail to meet me before I am halfway up. And I stand in the dark a long way from any light with a heart cooling in my hands, and I understand that I am not keeping a camp. I am feeding a thing that owns a hollow, and it lets me for now, and the day it decides it is done being fed by hand is a day I will not see coming. And when it comes, there will be a smell on the trail and a shape at the laurel edge, and a voice I love calling my name out of the dark. And I will have to stand there in my own headlamp and not go one more time, the way I have every winter since, the way Walt did for 40 years before me, the way somebody in this family will have to do after I am in the ground beside him. The heart is always warm in my hands the whole way up. I have never once carried one up that did not stay warm the whole way. I do not know what to make of that, and I have stopped trying to. I just carry it up, and I leave it, and the woods eat first. The forest was breaking apart in the dark, and it sounded like a war. That was the third night of the ice, and by then the trees had taken on more than they could hold. A quarter-inch of clear ice over every branch and twig for 100,000 acres. And all night long the limbs were coming down under the weight of it, and the big ones going too, whole oaks splitting up the trunk with a crack like a rifle shot, and then the long tearing crash of them coming down through their neighbors. It went on all night, every night, close and far, and I lay in my bunk in the dark and listened to the woods I had known my whole life tearing itself to pieces around the cabin, and I could not do one thing about any of it, and neither could my brother, and I never got used to that. There had never in my life been a thing that Russ could not do something about. Russ was my brother. He was 11 years older than me, which meant he was closer to a father than a brother for most of the years that mattered, because our own father went into the ground when I was 6 and Russ was 17, and Russ was the one who raised me after that. Our mother worked 2 jobs and was gone most hours, a boy is awake. And it was Russ who taught me to tie my shoes over again the right way, and Russ who taught me to fish and to shoot and to drive. Russ who came to the school when I got in trouble because our mother could not leave the line at the plant. Russ who put off his own life a good 10 years to make sure mine got started. He gave up things for me that I did not understand he was giving up, until I was a grown man with a boy of my own and could see what it costs. I have loved a few people in my life, the ordinary amount. I loved my brother the other way, the way you love the person who stood between you and the cold when you were too small to stand there yourself. Everything I did up in that cabin, and everything I would not do, I did and did not do because he was my brother, and I loved him that way. The clearest thing I carry from those years is the shooting. Our father's rifle was a lever gun, a plain old thing worn silver at the edges, and it was the one thing of his that stayed in the house after he died. And when I was 8, Russ took me out behind the house one Saturday and started teaching me to shoot it. He was 19 then and had no business raising a boy and was doing it anyway. He would kneel down behind me in the cold, with his arms around me and his hands over my hands on that rifle, steadying it, his chin near my shoulder, and he would talk me through it low and patient. Breathe out, squeeze, do not pull. And I could feel his heartbeat against my back through both our coats, slow and steady, the steadiest thing in my whole shaken-up world. And I have thought since that I learned more from the heartbeat than from the rifle. He never once got sharp with me when I missed. Our father had been a sharp man, quick with the back of his hand, and Russ had come up under that and had decided somewhere along the way that he would be the opposite of it for me, and he was, every day, for years. And it cost him something to be that patient that I did not understand until I had a boy of my own and felt how hard it is to swallow your own bad temper for the sake of a child. That gentle, patient man was the same man who knelt in the woodshed in the dark. Both of those are true at once, and I have had to hold them both every day for 20 years, and it does not get easier with the holding. We went up to the camp the third week of January, the four of us. It was a thing we did every winter, a long weekend up at the old coal camp in Coldwater after the seasons were closed. No hunting, just the wood stove and the cards and the whiskey and the quiet away for the men in the family to be men in the family for a few days. The camp belonged to Merrill Cole, who was not blood but was as good as an old man of near 80 who had been our father's best friend and had helped Russ raise me the way an uncle does, from a distance, with a hard hand when it was called for and a soft one when it counted. Merrill came up with us every year, and that year I had brought my boy Tyler, who was 22 and just out of a hitch in the army and trying to find his feet again, quiet since he got back, and I had thought the woods and his great-uncle Merrill's stories and a few days with his Uncle Russ might do him some good. So it was the four of us, 2 old men and 2 younger ones, 3 generations of the same family in one cabin, and I have gone over and over whether I should have brought the boy, and there is no answer to it that helps, so I have stopped asking. We drove up on the Thursday in Merrill's old truck, and Russ's, 2 vehicles for the 4 of us and the wood and the whiskey and the coolers, up the state road and off onto the forest road and up the camp road that we would not see again the way it was. And it was a clear, hard, cold afternoon with the light going gold over the ridges and none of us knew a thing. Tyler rode up with me and did not talk much, which was how he was since he got home, but he cracked the window and put his arm out into the cold the way he did when he was small, and I took that for a good sign. Merrill got to the camp first and had the stove going before we finished unloading, and by dark the cabin was warm and close and smelled like wood smoke and coffee and the old cabin smell of 40 years of the same men coming back to the same room. And Merrill was already into his stories. The one about the buck that got away in 1971, the one about my father in the canoe, and I watched my son laugh, a real laugh. The first one I had heard out of him since he got back, at his great-uncle telling a story he had heard 100 times, and I looked across the lamplight at Russ, and Russ was watching the boy laugh too, and Russ looked at me and did not say anything, just nodded a little, and I knew we were both thinking the same thing, which was that this was why we came up, this exact warm hour. 3 generations of one family safe in one lit room with the cold shut outside where it belonged. I have gone back to that hour more times than I can count. It was the last good one. I did not know to hold on to it while I had it, and maybe that is a mercy, because a man cannot enjoy an hour he knows is the last one. The ice started the first night, and nobody thought much of it. Ice storms come through that country most winters. You wake up to the world glazed over and beautiful, and you stay off the roads for a day, and it melts, and that is that, but this one did not melt. The temperature sat right at the freezing mark for a day and a night, and the rain kept coming and freezing where it fell, layer on layer, and by the second morning the power was out, which did not worry us either, because the camp ran on a wood stove and lamps and a spring for water, and we had come up to be off the grid anyway. The strange thing, the thing I think about, is how beautiful it was at the start. That first full day of the ice, before the trees began to break, the whole forest turned to glass. Every branch and every dead weed and every strand of old grass sheathed in clear ice, and the sun came out for an hour around noon and lit the whole of it up so that the woods threw the light back in a million pieces, blinding, like a country made out of chandeliers. And we stood out on the porch, the four of us, and just looked at it, and Merrill said he had never in 80 years seen the beat of it, and he had not, and none of us had. And Tyler took pictures on his phone while the phone still had a charge. It was the most beautiful thing I ever saw in those woods. I have thought since that this is how it works up there, that the country shows you the most beautiful face it has right before it shows you the other one. The way my brother's easy smile would come back over the top of the thing in his eyes. The beauty is not a lie exactly. It is real. It is just not the whole of what is there, and a man who lets the beauty tell him he is safe has already made the first mistake. It was the second night that the trees started coming down, and the third night that it became the worst of it, and it was the fourth morning, when Russ and I walked out to try to get down to the trucks, that we understood what had happened to us. The camp road was gone. Not blocked in one place or two. Gone. Every tree along both sides of that 2-mile road had shed its top or fallen entire across it, and where the road ran through the low ground, it was under a tangle of ice timber 10 and 12 feet high that no man was going to cut through with the 2 chainsaws we had, not in a week, maybe not in a month. And it was not just our road. We got up onto the ridge behind the camp where you could see out across the valley toward the state road, and the whole forest as far as we could see was down, gray and broken and shining under the ice. Every ridge of it flattened and tangled, no smoke anywhere, no sound of an engine, no sign that anywhere in that whole white ruined country there was a single other living soul. The radio in Merrill's old truck still worked when we went and sat in it and ran the battery, and what it told us was worse than the silence. The ice had taken down the grid across 4 states. Transmission towers folded like wet cardboard. Whole counties black. The announcers were saying weeks. They were saying it could be weeks before power came back to the rural areas, and they were saying stay home, stay off the roads, do not travel, help your neighbors. And they were not saying one word about anybody. Coming up a washed-out camp road 2 miles into a state forest to check on 4 men nobody knew were there. We had told people we would be back Monday. This was Thursday. When we did not come back Monday, somebody would worry, and somebody would eventually call somebody, and eventually, in a state torn up the way the radio said this one was, with every emergency crew in 4 states buried in work, and every road a problem, somebody might get around to sending a man up the coal camp road to look for us. Eventually, Russ sat in the cab of that truck with me and did the arithmetic out loud in his flat, steady way, the way he had done every hard piece of arithmetic in my life since I was 6 years old, and the arithmetic came out to this. We were on our own, in a broken forest, in the cold, with what food was in the camp for a length of time that no one could promise would be short. And then Russ shut the radio off to save the battery, and he looked at me and he smiled a little the way he did, and he said we had been in tighter spots, which was not true. We had never once in our lives been in a spot anything like this one, and I knew it was not true, and he knew, I knew, and I loved him for saying it, and we went back inside to tell the old man and the boy. The first days we did all right. We were 4 grown men who knew the woods, and we had a sound cabin and a good stove, and plenty of wood once we started cutting the down timber right there in the yard. And we had food, not a lot, but the camp always kept a stock, canned goods and dry goods, and what was in the little propane freezer that was slowly thawing now that the power was gone. We rationed it from the first day because Russ made us, over Merrill's grumbling that we would be out of there before it mattered. Russ did not think we would be out of there before it mattered. Russ had done the arithmetic, and he set us on short rations the first night and held us there, and I have thanked God more than once that he did, because the days we did all right were not many, and the cold was working on us the whole time in ways we did not feel until they had already gone deep. Merrill was the best of us in those first days, and he deserves remembering right, because what came after put such a shadow over that trip that a man could forget there was any good in it at all, and there was. And most of it was Merrill. He was near 80 and cold to the bone, same as the rest of us, and he spent what he had keeping the boys' spirits up. He had known my father as a young man, and he told Tyler the stories about his own grandfather that Tyler had never heard, the good ones and the ones that were mostly lies, and he taught the boy a card game his own father had taught him. And the two of them, the oldest of us and the youngest, sat by that stove, hand after hand, while Russ and I were out in the dead woods. And I would come back frozen and empty-handed and hear my son laughing before I even got the door open, and it was Merrill doing that. Merrill spending his last good days making a scared young man laugh in a freezing cabin. He knew he was failing before any of us did. I see that now. The night before he went quiet, he called me over and told me, low, that if it came to hard choices up here, I was to put the boy first. Ahead of him, ahead of anybody. And I told him it would not come to that. And he patted my hand the way you pat the hand of a person who has not understood you, and he did not argue. And 2 days later he was gone. And he had made sure with his last clear words that the youngest of us would be the one carried through. There was more of Merrill in what Russ did in that woodshed than I let myself think about for a long time. The old man pointed the way with his own dying, and my brother followed it, and both of them did it out of the same thing, and the woods took one of them for it, and left the other in the ground a hero, and there is no justice in which was which that I have ever been able to find. It was the cold that took Merrill. He was near 80, and he had a heart that had been patched twice, and a man like that has no reserve against real cold, the kind of cold that gets into a cabin when it is 10 degrees outside and the stove can only do so much, and the ice is a foot thick on the north wall. Merrill got quiet around the 5th day. He had been the loud one, the storyteller, keeping the boys' spirits up with the old tales, and then he got quiet, and he sat closer and closer to the stove, and he stopped eating even his short ration and told us to give it to Tyler, that a growing man needed it more than an old one. And I did not understand until later that Merrill had already done his own arithmetic, and did not much like his answer, and had decided quietly to spend what he had left, keeping the rest of us going. He died in his sleep on the 7th night. It was peaceful, I think, as those things go. He was there in the morning, and he was not warm, and Russ knelt by him a long time with his hand on the old man's chest, and then Russ pulled the blanket up over Merrill's face, and Tyler turned away to the wall, and none of us said much, because there was not much to say, and because saying it would have used strength we did not have to spare. We carried Merrill out to the woodshed. The ground was iron and buried under ice, and there was no burying him, so we wrapped him in his blanket and a tarp, and we carried him out to the far corner of the woodshed where it was coldest, and we laid him there. And Russ said some words over him, the Lord's Prayer, and a little more, and we shut the shed and went back in to the two who were left of the 4, my brother and my son and me. And the storm had stopped by then, but the cold had not, and the radio when we ran the battery still said weeks, still said stay home, still said no help coming to the places like where we were. The days after Merrill went into the shed had a shape to them, hard as they were, and the shape was Russ. My brother ran that camp the way he had run every hard thing, with a schedule and a set of jobs and a flat refusal to let any of us sit still long enough to give up. There was wood to cut, always, the down timber right there in the yard needing bucked and split to keep the one stove fed, and Russ kept us at it in shifts so that no man got too cold and no man got too idle. There was water to melt and boil. There was the hunting, such as it was, the two of us out in the gray mornings while Tyler kept the fire working the ridges and the yards where a deer might have holed up, coming back empty near every time. And there was the keeping of Tyler, which was the real work, the work under all the other work, because a young man alone with his own dark thoughts in a freezing cabin will go down faster than his body will. And Russ knew it, and Russ spent what he had on the boy. He got Tyler talking, a little at a time, about the army, about the things Tyler had not told me, his own father, and I understood watching it that Russ was doing for my son in that cabin exactly what he had done for me 30 years before, standing between a scared young man and the cold, and doing it while he was starving, doing it while he was giving the boy his own share when he thought I was not looking. I caught him at that twice. I made him stop. He did not stop. That was Russ down to the ground, right up until the door opened in the woodshed. My brother was spending the last of himself to keep my boy alive, and that the thing that got into him got in through a door he only opened because there was nothing left in him but love, and it had run out of any other way to spend itself. After that, the days ran together and the food ran out. I am not going to stretch the hunger out, because there is nothing in it worth stretching. Anybody who has been truly hungry, past the point where it is an ache and into the point where it is a cold, clear stupidity that sits behind your eyes, knows that it is the most boring agony there is. It just goes on. We had made the stores last as long as men could make them last, and then there was a day when there was a little, and then there was a day when there was almost nothing, and then there were days when there was nothing at all but melted snow, and the coffee we brewed over and over out of the same grounds, because the warmth of it was a lie the body would still believe for a few minutes. We tried to hunt. There was nothing to hunt. The ice storm had killed or driven off everything that could leave, and the deer that were left were yarded up somewhere deep and dying on their feet. And in a week of setting out in the mornings, the most Russ and I ever came back with was a gray squirrel that we made the last 2 days between the three of us. I remember one of those hunts better than the others. Russ and I had gone out before light and split up along a ridge, and I had sat a long cold hour over a deer trail with no deer on it, and when the light came up gray I worked my way over to where Russ was supposed to be, and I found him standing in a little bowl in the timber, not hunting, just standing, looking down at something in the snow. It was a deer, or it had been, a doe, gone down in the storm, half under a fallen limb, frozen hard, and something had already been at it, and Russ was standing over it, looking down with an expression I did not have a name for yet. I came up beside him, and I said we could take what was left. That frozen was as good as a freezer, and Russ did not answer me right away. He kept looking at the doe, and then he said, quiet, not really to me, that the woods were eating everything up here, that he could feel it, that the whole country was one big empty stomach this winter, and we were standing inside it. It was a strange thing for Russ to say. Russ was not a man who talked that way, and I put it down to how tired and hungry we both were, and I bent to salvage what I could off that doe, and when I looked up, Russ was still staring down into the little bowl like he was listening to something under the snow, and I had to say his name twice to bring him back. He had not turned yet then. That was days before the woodshed. But I have wondered since if the woods had already started talking to him out there, picking him out, the way you pick out the one tree in a stand you mean to fall, and if a part of him heard it that morning over the frozen doe and did not have the words to tell me what he was hearing. The forest was as dead and empty as the surface of the moon, gray and shining and silent, and we walked out into it every morning, growing weaker, and came back every evening with nothing, and Tyler got worse. My boy was the one it was hardest on, and that was its own kind of hell, because a father is built to feed his child, and there was nothing to feed him with. Tyler was young and strong, and that meant his body burned through what little we could give him faster than ours did, and by the second week he was going bad, sleeping most of the day, his face gone gray and sharp, his hands shaking when he held the coffee cup, and when he talked, which was not often. He did not always make sense. I sat up with him at night, and I held his hand the way I had held it when he was small, and I lied to him the way Russ lied to me in the truck, told him we would be out soon, told him he just had to hold on, and over the top of my boy's head in the lamplight I would meet my brother's eyes, and my brother was doing arithmetic again. I could see him doing it. Russ had been doing arithmetic his whole life, hard arithmetic that other people did not want to do, and I could see him working a new problem behind his eyes as he watched my son go down, and I did not let myself understand what the problem was, because a part of me had already understood, and understood what the answer was going to be. and could not hold it and stay sane. There was a night, deep in the second week, when I woke and Russ was not in his bunk. The stove was down to coals and Tyler was asleep and breathing bad, and the cabin door was closed, but the cold coming off it said it had been opened not long before. And I lay there in the dark, and I did not go to the window, and I did not call out, and I did not get up. I have had to live with that. I lay in my bunk in the dark, and I heard my brother come back in from the woodshed after a while, quiet, and I heard him at the stove, and I heard other sounds I made myself not hear. And in the morning there was meat, and Russ said he had gotten a deer, set it flat, set it looking right at me. A big doe yarded up in the hemlocks off the ridge, and there was no deer hide and no deer bones and no gut pile out in that yard where a man would leave them, and I knew there was not. And I looked at my brother, and my brother looked at me, and then I looked at my son, who needed to eat or die, and I took the plate. God help me. I took the plate, and I fed my son, and I ate, and I did not ask my brother the question that had no good answer, and for 2 days the three of us were stronger. And that is where it should end, if there were any mercy in the world, with a terrible thing done for love and 3 people alive who would otherwise be dead. But there is no mercy up in that country. There is only the hunger, and the hunger had been waiting a long time for a door, and Russ had just opened one. The first thing I noticed was that Russ stopped being cold. We were all cold all the time by then, cold the way you are cold when you have not been warm in 2 weeks and have no fat left on you to burn, a bone cold that no fire quite reached, and we shook with it, all of us, a low steady shiver that never entirely stopped even up close to the stove. And then one evening I looked across the cabin at my brother, and Russ was not shaking. He sat by the window away from the fire with his coat open, in a cabin where the rest of us were bundled to the eyes and shivering, and he sat there still and easy with his coat hanging open, looking out at the dark, and he was not cold. I asked him, was he all right? Was he warm enough? And he turned and looked at me and smiled and said he was fine, said he was warm, actually warmer than he had been in days. And there was nothing wrong in how he said it. It was Russ's voice and Russ's easy smile, and I told myself a man's body does strange things when it is starving, and let it go. Then I touched him. It was a day or 2 later. He was at the stove, and I came up beside him to take the coffee, and my hand brushed the back of his hand, and I pulled back like I had touched the stove itself, except it was the opposite of the stove. His hand was cold. Not cool, not chilled. Cold the way the iron latch on the door was cold. Cold the way a thing is cold when it has been sitting out in the 10-degree dark all night. And I stood there staring at my brother's hand, and Russ looked at me and asked what was wrong, and I said his hand was freezing, said he needed to get closer to the fire. And Russ looked down at his own hand like it belonged to somebody else, and then he looked back at me, and for just 1 second before the easy smile came back, there was something in my brother's face that was not my brother. It looked at me out of his eyes the way a man looks out a window at a stranger in his yard. Then it was gone, and it was Russ again. And Russ said he felt fine, said he felt warm, and he took his cold hand back and held it out toward the stove to please me. And the flames did not warm it, and I do not think he could feel them at all. I knew things, is the trouble. Some of us who grew up in that country grew up with a little of the old talk, from grandparents, from old men at deer camps, and most of us laughed it off the way you laugh off any old talk, and I had laughed it off my whole life. But I knew, in the way you know the words to a song you have not heard since you were a child, that there were things you did not do up in the high forest, and that at the top of the list of things you did not do was the thing my brother had done in the woodshed in the dark to keep my son alive. Our father had a saying about Coldwater. He would not let us come up here to camp when there was real hardship in the world, in the bad years, in the hungry years, and when I was a boy and asked him why he had said, "You do not come to Coldwater when you are desperate," and he had not explained it, and I had forgotten it for 30 years until I stood in that cabin and watched a thing look out of my brother's eyes at me, and then I remembered it whole, and understood that my father had known, and that his father had told him, and that the knowing had come down to me too late to do anything but name what I was watching. I told no one, because there was no one to tell. It is a particular kind of alone, to be shut in a small room with two people you love, and to be carrying a thing you cannot say to either of them. I could not tell Tyler, who was a boy and my son, and had no business carrying it. And I could not tell Russ, because Russ was the thing, and how do you turn to a man and tell him you have seen what is climbing up out of him, and what would it do, the thing in him, if it knew that I knew? So I carried it by myself in that cabin, hour by hour, watching my brother across the room I could have crossed in 4 steps, and it was the loneliest I have ever been in my life, lonelier than any empty house, because loneliness in an empty house is just the absence of people, and this was the absence of the one person left in the room. Russ was right there, and Russ was already gone, and I was mourning him to his face while he still walked and talked, and there is no harder grief than that, the grief for a man who is still in the room with you, getting up, sitting down, saying your name. The eating was next. Once Tyler was strong enough to be up and around, and the last of what Russ had brought from the shed was gone, we were back to nothing, back to melted snow and old coffee grounds. And Tyler and I went back to being hungry. The boring, endless way. But Russ was hungrier. Russ, who was not cold, who should have been the steadiest of us because he had eaten the most, was hungry in a way that had gone past hunger into something else. He talked about food. He had never been a man who talked about food, and now he talked about it low and constant, meals from 30 years ago, the taste of things, and his eyes moved around the cabin while he talked. And I did not like where his eyes moved. He gnawed. We had no food, and he gnawed anyway, on a leather bootlace, on a piece of pine kindling, on the sleeve of his own coat, his jaw working and working. And once I woke in the night to a sound in the dark, and it was Russ sitting up in his bunk in the black with no light anywhere, and his jaw was going, chewing, steady and wet and patient, chewing on nothing at all, on the dark itself. And I lay there and listened to my brother chew on nothing in the dark for the better part of an hour, and I did not say his name, because I was afraid that if I said his name, the chewing would stop, and he would turn his head and look at me. And I could not have borne it if the thing that looked at me was not my brother. His eyes started catching the light. A dog's eyes, or a deer's eyes, throw the light back green or gold when a beam catches them, and a person's eyes do not, because we are not made that way. Russ's eyes started doing it. Across the cabin in the lamplight, at a certain angle, when he turned his head, my brother's eyes threw the lamplight back at me, flat and bright, like an animal's at the edge of a headlight. A dull shine where no shine should be, and then he would turn a little more and they would be just eyes again, just Russ's tired, hungry eyes, and I would tell myself I had imagined it, and I had not imagined it, and I knew I had not. The boy started to feel it before he understood it. Tyler had come out of the worst of the hunger once there was food, and he was up and moving and himself again in his body, but he was not stupid. And he began to watch his Uncle Russ, the way an animal watches a thing it cannot name but does not trust. He stopped sitting close to Russ. He had always sat close to Russ since he was little, and now without seeming to decide it, he kept the table between them, kept me between them. And one gray afternoon, while Russ was out in the yard standing, in the cold, with no coat, just standing, facing north, not doing anything, Tyler came to me low and asked me what was wrong with Uncle Russ. He asked it like a much younger boy, and I looked at my son, and I did the hardest small thing I did in that whole cabin, which was to lie to his face and keep my own face easy while I did it. I told him his uncle was taking the loss of Merrill hard, that grief does strange things to a man, that he should give Russ some room. Tyler looked at me for a moment too long, the way he did, and I do not know to this day how much he believed, and how much he only agreed to believe because the truth was standing in the yard facing north with no coat on, and neither of us wanted it to be true. He gave Russ room. He gave him more and more room, and the cabin, which had never been big, got smaller and smaller as the three of us sorted ourselves into the two who kept close to the fire and the one who did not need it anymore. And I lay awake between them at night doing the arithmetic Russ had taught me, and the arithmetic had gotten simple and terrible, There was no food. There would be no food. And there were only 2 warm bodies left in that cabin that a starving thing could count, and I was guarding one of them and could not guard myself. And every night the man across the room was a little less my brother and a little more the cold, clear appetite that had been in these woods since before our people ever came to them. And his voice changed last, and that was the worst, because the voice was the last of my brother I had left to hold on to. It came on slow. At first it was just that he talked less and lower, and then it was that the warmth went out of it. The particular warmth that had been in Russ's voice my whole life. The warmth that had told a scared 6-year-old boy that everything was going to be all right and been believed. That went out of it a little at a time, like heat leaving a stone, until what was left was flat and even and cold. My brother's voice with my brother taken out of it, and he used it less and less. And when he did use it near the end, he mostly used it to say one thing. He said my name. He would look at me across the cabin in the dark, with his eyes throwing back the coals, and he would say my name, flat, Cole, just my name, the way you would test a door to see if it was locked. And I would say, "What, Russ, what do you need?" And he would not answer. He would just watch me, and after a while he would say it again. Cole, like he was learning the shape of it, like he was saving it for later. There was a night I watched him from the window, and I have never told this part to a living soul. Russ had gone out. By then he went out most nights, out into cold that would have killed either of us in an hour, and stood in the yard, and I had learned to lie in my bunk and wait it out. But this night I got up, quiet, and I went to the little window by the door, and I looked out, and there was a moon on the snow, and I found him. He was standing out past the woodpile in the open, in his shirt sleeves, an air that was 10 below if it was anything. And he was not shivering, and he was not hunched against it, and he was not doing anything a cold man does. He was standing easy, the way you stand on a porch on a summer evening, his face turned up a little, and he was breathing slow, and I could see his breath going up white and steady in the moonlight. And I stood at that window and watched my brother stand comfortable and cold that should have been killing him. And I understood all the way down, in a way I had been holding off understanding, that wherever the warmth in a man comes from, the thing that makes the cold hurt, the thing that makes him a warm, live animal that wants to get in by the fire, that thing had gone out of my brother, and something had moved into the space it left, something that liked the cold, that was made of the cold, that was finally home out there in it under the moon. He stood out there better than an hour. I went back to my bunk before he came in because I did not want him to know I had seen. And in the morning he sat by the window with his coat open and said he had slept fine, and I said I had too, and we both lied across the last of the food. And the boy watched us both from over by the stove and said nothing. I stopped sleeping. Somewhere in there I understood that one of us had to be awake in between Russ and the boy at every hour, and that it had to be me because Tyler did not know yet, not all the way. Tyler was still calling him Uncle Russ and still trying to get the old warmth back out of him, and I could not tell my son that the man who had saved his life by damning himself was now the thing most likely to end it. So I stopped sleeping. I kept the fire up, and I kept the camp rifle across my knees, a lever gun that had been our father's, and I sat between my brother's bunk and my son's bunk through the black hours, and I watched Russ not sleep either, the two of us awake in the dark on opposite sides of the room, and sometimes his eyes would throw back the coals, and I would put my hand on the rifle, and he would see me do it, and neither of us would say anything, and the fire would tick, and the night would go on. There was a night before the last night when it nearly went wrong early. I had held out, as long as a man can hold out, against sleep 4 days. 5, I had lost the count. And somewhere in the blackest part of one of those nights, my body simply took the sleep it needed, whether I allowed it or not, and I went under, sitting up with a rifle in my lap. I do not know how long. I came up out of it the way you come up out of deep water with your lungs burning, all at once, and knowing something was wrong. And Russ was off his bunk and halfway across the floor, low, quiet, between me and Tyler, closer to the boy than to me, and his eyes were lit and his jaw was going, and I got the rifle up and got a sound out of my throat that was supposed to be his name, and came out as just a sound. And he stopped. He stopped and he stood up straight in the middle of the floor, and he looked at me, and for a long moment the two of us stood inside that look, and I felt the whole thing balanced on it, felt how close the floor was to going out from under all three of us. And then Russ smiled, the easy smile, and he said he was just getting up to put wood on the fire, and he turned and he put wood on the fire, and he went back to his bunk, and he lay down. And I sat there shaking, not from the cold, and I understood two things. I understood that the thing in him was patient and would wait for me to fail, and I understood that some part of my brother was still in there fighting it, because a thing that was all the way turned would not have stopped for a sound in my throat, and would not have bothered with the lie about the fire, and would not have gone back to its bunk and left the boy be for one more night. Russ was still holding the door from the inside. That was the last comfort I had, and it was a terrible comfort, because I knew what it was costing him, and I knew the arithmetic, and I knew he could not hold it much longer. It came to a head on the last night. It came to a head on the last night, though I did not know it was the last night when it started. The cold had finally broken that day. The temperature had come up above freezing for the first time in almost 3 weeks, and the ice had begun to let go, sliding off the branches and sheets, dripping and cracking and settling all through the woods. And for the first time there was running water again, the creek down below the camp waking back up under its lid of ice. And I had stood out in the yard that afternoon in the strange warm air and understood that the thaw meant a man might be able to get down the mountain now, might be able to follow the creek down to the valley and out. And I had come back in with that thought and one other writing under it that I would not look at straight. That night Russ got up. I had drifted, God forgive me, just for a minute, just my eyes closing on the rifle, and I came awake to the sound of the floor, and Russ was up. Russ was across the room. Russ was standing over Tyler's bunk in the dark, looking down at my sleeping son with his head tilted the way a bird tilts its head, and his jaw was going slow, and one of his cold hands was reaching down toward the boy's face, and I said his name. I said it hard. I said, Russ, and I brought the rifle up, and he straightened and turned and looked at me across the barrel of our father's gun, and his eyes threw the coals back at me, flat and bright, and there was nothing behind them that I knew, nothing. The window looked out on an empty yard, and I had the gun on my brother's chest and my finger on the trigger, and I could not pull it. I could tell myself I did not pull it, because I knew a bullet would not stop the thing he had become, and there is truth in that. The old talk said as much, and I believed it. But that is not why my finger would not move. My finger would not move because he was Russ, because he had tied my shoes and taught me to shoot with that same gun, because you cannot shoot the person who stood between you and the cold. Your body will not do it. Mine would not, and we stood there frozen, the thing wearing my brother and me, the gun between us, doing nothing. And then Russ came back. I have no other way to say it. For one moment, the last moment, the thing in his face pulled back, and my brother rose up behind his own eyes like a man coming up out of deep water, and his face broke. It just broke. All the flat cold went out of it, and it was Russ, my Russ, looking at me in an agony I cannot describe, with the gun still on his chest. And he said my name, and this time it was his voice, the warm one, the one from when I was 6, cracked and shaking, but his. He said, Cole. He said, Cole, get him out. He said the cold was broken, the creek was open, and I was to take Tyler and follow the water down and not stop and not come back. And I said I was not leaving him. I said it like a child. I said, Russ, I am not leaving you up here. And my brother smiled at me with tears freezing on his face and shook his head, and he said, You already did, buddy. You already did. There is nothing up here to leave. And he told me the last thing while he was still himself enough to tell it. He said, Do not follow me. He said, whatever comes down out of these woods after tonight, whatever calls to you, whatever it sounds like, you do not follow it and you do not answer it. He said, promise me, and I promised him. I promised my brother standing there with our father's rifle between us. And he nodded, and he looked at me one more second out of his own eyes, and then he set them free. He turned, and he walked to the door. He did not lunge, and he did not rush us. He just walked. Easy, the way Russ always walked. And he opened the cabin door on the dripping dark, and he looked back once. And I do not know if that last look was my brother or the thing. I have never known, and I have decided I do not want to know. Then he walked out into the thaw, and he turned north. North was up over the ridge and down the far side toward the old dead town, and the bald smoking ground past it that never freezes and never thaws. The warm ground, the ground the old talk said such things go to. And I stood in the cabin door with the rifle hanging from my hand, and I watched my brother walk away from me up the black wet slope toward the warm ground in the north, not hurrying, at home in the cold, now the way he had been at home in every hard place his whole life. And the dark took him, and I did not follow him, and I have kept that promise every day since, which has been the hardest promise I ever kept, and I keep it still. I do not know how long I stood in that open door after the dark took him. Long enough that the cold came all the way into the cabin, and Tyler stirred in his bunk. I stood there with our father's rifle hanging from my hand, and I looked at the black slope where my brother had gone up toward the warm ground in the north, and everything in me wanted to go after him, not to save him. I understood there was no saving him, but just to not let him go up there alone, the way he had never once let me go anywhere alone my whole life. That is the pull it works on. It is not a monster jumping out of the dark. It is your own love for the person turned around and pointed back at you like your own rifle, and the only thing that kept my feet on that floorboard was the last true thing my brother ever asked of me, and the boy breathing behind me, who needed his father to not walk out that door. So I did not walk out. I shut the door on the dark and the cold and the north slope and the last of my brother, and I turned around to the one I could still save, and that turning around, that shutting of the door with my brother on the other side of it, is the single hardest thing I have ever done, and I did it, and I have had to keep doing it, in a way, every winter since. Every time the voice comes, and I shut the door again. Then I woke my son, and I got him up and into every layer of clothes we had. I took our father's rifle and what little we could carry, and Tyler kept asking where Uncle Russ was. And I told him Uncle Russ had gone for help, which was the last lie I told my boy in that cabin, and maybe the only merciful one. And we went out into the breaking dark, and we found the creek where it had come alive under the ice, and we followed the water down the mountain the way Russ told me to, down and down through the wrecked and dripping forest. And we did not stop, and we did not go back. And a little after full light, on the far side of that longest night of my life, we came out at the bottom onto a plowed road with a state truck sitting on it, and two men in orange coats who had finally come looking. And it was over. The part in the cabin was over. The other part does not end. I told the state police and the sheriff and the men from the district that Merrill Cole had died of his heart on the 7th night, which was true, and that my brother Russell had gone out in the thaw to try to reach help and had not come back, which was a lie shaped like the truth, close enough to it that no part of me had to work to keep the story straight. They found Merrill in the woodshed when they finally got a crew up that road in the spring, and I had spent the weeks before that not sleeping over what they would find and what it would look like and what they would make of it. And in the end, the report said, what reports say, that the remains had been disturbed by animals over the long weeks in the shed, which is a thing that happens. Everyone knows it happens. And no man on that crew stood in that cold shed and let himself think any other thought, because the other thoughts are not thoughts a person can hold and go home to supper. So Merrill was buried proper at last, and my brother went into the county records, the same as Boyd Kettleman, and God knows how many before him, lost in the woods, body unrecovered, presumed dead. And that was true too, and it was not the truth at all. And I have made my home in the gap between those two things, the way you make a home in a country you did not choose. They searched for Russ that spring when the woods opened up. Dogs and a helicopter and a line of men. The dogs worked the whole camp and the whole ridge, and then they got to the top of the north slope, where the ground starts down toward the old dead town and the bald smoking ground past it, and the dogs would not go down the north slope, would not. Sat down at the top of it and would not be moved, and the handler said he had never seen the like, and the search turned back and they found nothing. And I was standing there when the dogs sat down, and I knew exactly why they sat down, and I did not say, because there was nothing to say that would have done anything but get me a bed in a hospital. Tyler does not know. That is the weight I carry, that is mine alone, heavier even than the rest. My son believes his Uncle Russ died a hero in an ice storm going for help, and that his great-uncle Merrill died of his heart, both of which are close enough to true. And he does not know what kept him alive in that cabin, and he does not know what his uncle became, and he does not know what walked out the door into the thaw, and I have decided, and I decide it again every single day, that he never will, not from me. It has cost him anyway. He came home from that mountain quieter than he came home from the army, and he has had his troubles since, the sleeping and the drinking and the long silences, and I have sat with him through them the way I sat with him in the cabin, and I have never once been able to tell him the true name of the thing that is haunting him, because the true name would break him worse than the not knowing, and so we both carry it, him not knowing what he carries, and me knowing too well, and that is the arrangement in my family now. That is what we brought down off that mountain instead of my brother. I have never told anyone what comes next. I am telling it now because I am getting old, and because somebody in my family may stand someday where I have stood and need to know it was real. Russ still calls. It started the first winter after, and it has come every hard winter since, better than 20 of them now. When the real cold comes, the deep cold, the kind that freezes the ground hard and puts the ice back in the trees, and the nights get long and black and still, my brother calls to me, not in dreams. I am a plain man, and I know the difference between a dream and a thing that happens, and this happens. I will be out at my own woodpile after dark in January, in my own yard, 100 miles from Coldwater, and out past the edge of the light where the yard goes into the tree line, my brother will say my name. His voice, Cole, the warm one most times, the one from when I was 6, gentle, glad, the way he used to call me in from playing when supper was ready. Cole, come on in now. And every time, every single time across better than 20 years, everything in me that is still a scared 6-year-old boy who loved his big brother more than his own life wants to answer it. Wants to walk out past the edge of the light toward that warm, familiar voice in the dark and be his little brother again. That is what it is counting on. That is what it has always been counting on. It did not take my brother's face or my brother's hands. It took his voice, the warmest thing about him, the thing it knew would work on me, and it has been standing at the edge of my light for 20 winters, calling me out into the dark with it. I do not answer. I made a promise to the last of my brother that was still my brother, standing over our father's rifle, and I have kept it every winter since. I do not answer it, and I do not walk toward it, and I do not, God help me, ever let it know that I heard. I finish loading my arms with wood, and I walk back inside my warm house where my wife is, and where my grown son sometimes is, and I shut the door, and I build the fire up, and I keep it burning, and I do not go back out until the sun is up. That is the whole of what I know how to do. Keep the fire, and do not answer, and do not follow, and wait for the light. Some winters it does not come, and those are the winters I am most afraid, because it means it is out working some other edge of some other man's light, or worse, that it is closer than the tree line and waiting to be sure of me. And these last few years it has learned a new thing, and I will say it, and then I am done. These last few years, when the warm voice does not draw me, when I stand at my woodpile and do not turn toward it, my brother's voice changes, out there in the dark, the way it changed in the cabin, the warmth going out of it like heat leaving a stone, and it says the other thing. It says the thing Russ said last, the thing my brother spent the final human moment of his life saying to save my son. It stands at the edge of my light, in the deep cold, with my brother's cold, flat voice, and it says, "Cole, get him out." And it waits, because it knows, the way it has always known which voice to use, that the one thing that might still make me walk out into the dark after all these years is not being called home. It is being told my boy is out there in the cold and needs me. It has my brother's voice, and it has my brother's last words, and it has all the time in the world. And every winter it is a little more sure of me, and I am a little older and a little more tired. And one of these long black January nights, it is going to use exactly the right words and exactly the right voice. And I am afraid that I am only a man, and that a man can only keep a promise so long, and that the woods are patient, and that they have never once been in a hurry, and that they can wait out anything, even love, even this, even me. I never went back to Coldwater, and I never will, and I have done the one thing my father did for me, which is to put the warning into the family without the whole of the reason. My grandchildren are coming up now, Tyler's kids, and there will come a day when one of them wants to take a camp up in that country, and when that day comes I will say to them what my father said to me, that you do not go to Coldwater when you are desperate, and I will not explain it the same as he did not explain it, because the explaining is a weight and the words are enough to keep a careful person out, and the careless ones were never going to listen anyway. That is how the knowing comes down. A little too late to save the one it was meant for, and just in time, God willing, to save the next. I am a link in that now. My father handed it to me over a frozen dough I did not think about for 30 years, and I am handing it on, and somewhere down the line a boy of my blood is going to stand at the edge of some killing cold and remember an old man telling him not to come to Coldwater desperate, and maybe that will be the thing that turns him back. And he will never know that the reason his family carries that saying is walking the warm ground in the north, in his great-great-uncle Russ's shape, calling. So I keep the fire. That is all a man can do, up against a thing like that. He keeps the fire, and he does not answer the voice, and he holds on to the one still in the light with him, and he makes it to morning, and then he does it again the next night, and the next, for as many winters as he is given, and he prays the cold takes him in his sleep, to some warm, safe night, in his own bed, before it finds the words he cannot say no to. My brother stood between me and the cold my whole life. The last thing he ever did with his own heart was try to keep standing there. I have spent 20 years trying to be worth that, sitting up by my fire on the black nights with my hand not reaching for the door, and I do not know how many winters I have left in me, and I do not know if I will keep the promise all the way to the end of them. Some night the cold will come with exactly the right voice, and I will find out. Until then I keep the fire, and I do not answer, and I wait for the light, and I do not follow my brother up into the north where the ground is warm, and nothing that goes in ever comes back down.